as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the business of the House motion, motion number 2 as on the order paper. Thank you. Moved on behalf of the Leader of the House. Thank you. The question is the business of the House motion as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the motion in the name of the Prime Minister relating to Iraq, coalition against Isil. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move the motion standing on the order paper in my name and those of my right honourable friends. The question before the House today is how we keep the British people safe from the threat posed by Isil, and in particular, what role our armed forces should play in the international coalition to dismantle and ultimately destroy what President Obama has rightly called this network of death. Mr. Speaker, there is no more serious an issue than asking our armed forces to put themselves in harm's way to protect our country. And I want to set out today why I believe that is necessary. If we are to do this, then there is a series of questions which must be answered. Is this in our national interest? In particular, is there a direct threat to the British people? Is there a comprehensive plan for dealing with this threat? Is the military element necessary? Is it necessary for us to take part in military action? Is it legal for us to take part? Will we be doing so with the support of local partners? And will doing this add up to a moral justification for putting the lives of British servicemen and women on the line? And above all, do we have a clear idea of what a successful outcome will look like? And are we convinced that our strategy can take us there? I want to address each of these questions head on. First, our national interest. Is there a threat to the British people? The answer is yes. Isil has already murdered 1 British hostage and is threatening the lives of 2 more. The first ISIL-inspired terrorist acts in Europe have already taken place with, for instance, the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels. Security services have disrupted 6 other known plots in Europe, as well as foiling a terrorist attack in Australia aimed at civilians, including British and American tourists. ISIL is a terrorist organisation unlike those we have dealt with before. The brutality is staggering. Beheadings, crucifixions, the gouging out of eyes, the use of rape as a weapon, the slaughter of children, all these things belong to the Dark Ages. But it is not just the brutality. It is backed by billions of dollars and has captured an arsenal of the most modern weapons. In the space of a few months, ISIL has taken control of territory which is greater than the size of Britain and is making millions selling oil to the Assad regime. It has already attacked Lebanon and boasts of its designs right up to the Turkish border. This is not a threat on the far side of the world. Left unchecked, we will face a terrorist caliphate on the shores of the Mediterranean and bordering a NATO member with a declared and proven determination to attack our country and our people. This is not the stuff of fantasy. It is happening in front of us, and we need to face up to it. Next, is there a clear, comprehensive plan? Yes. It starts at home with tough, uncompromising action to prevent attacks and hunt down those who are planning them. As the House knows, we are introducing new powers. These include strengthening our ability to seize passports and to stop suspects travelling. It includes stripping British nationality from dual nationals and ensuring that airlines comply with our no-fly lists. And in all of this, we're being clear about the cause of the terrorist threat we face. As I've said before, that means defeating the poisonous ideology of Islamist extremism by tackling all forms of extremism, not just the non-violent extremists, not just the violent extremists. So we are banning preachers of hate, prescribing organisations that incite terrorism, and stopping people from inciting hatred in our schools, universities and prisons. Now, of course, some will say that any action you take will further radicalise young people. I have to say this is a counsel of despair. The threat of radicalisation is already here. Young people have left our country to go and fight with these extremists. We must take action at home, but we must also have a comprehensive strategy to defeat these extremists abroad.
Two questions he's not put to himself. How long will this war last, and when will mission creep start?
Well, let me answer that very directly. This is going to be a mission that will take not just months, but years. But I believe we have to be prepared for that commitment. And the reason for that is, I think quite rightly, America, Britain and others are not contemplating putting combat troops on the ground. There will be troops on the ground, but they will be Iraqi troops, they will be Kurdish troops, and we should be supporting them in all the ways that I will describe. In terms of mission creep, I would address very directly later in my speech why we are discussing what is happening in Iraq today, and only that, and that is the motion in terms of the order paper. Let me give way to the Honourable Lady and then to my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. He said on a number of occasions in this House that we face a long-term generational struggle and the priority is to fight this poisonous ideology. Will he commit now to working with the mainstream moderate Muslim community in this country who see these atrocities carried out in the name of their religion and utterly reject them, and have a practical programme to make this happen?
I absolutely commit to doing that, and we have to do that not just in Britain but right around the world, and we should be very clear that the cause of this problem is the poisonous narrative of Islamist extremism. Wherever there are broken states, conflicts, civil wars, we see this problem arise, whether it is Boko Haram in Nigeria, or whether it is Al-Qaeda in the Yemen, or whether it is Isil in Iraq and Syria. And we need Muslims to reclaim their religion from these extremists, and that is happening in our country and happening around the world. It was notable that President Obama, in his speech to the United Nations, singled out Muslims in Britain who were saying this is not being done in my name, and we should praise those people too. Let me give way to my honourable friend.
The Prime Minister places his trust in the Iraqi army. The problem is that, having caused this mess in Iraq, we armed the Iraqi army, they ran away, and ISIL now has their arms. Is it seriously contended that by airstrikes alone we can actually roll back ISIL, or is this gesture politics?
To be absolutely direct, I am not claiming that by airstrikes alone we can roll back this problem. What this problem requires is a comprehensive strategy, including a well-formed Iraqi government and well-formed Iraqi armed forces, because they, in the end, will be the ones who have to defeat this on the ground. But where I, hold on 2 seconds, where I disagree with my honourable friend in the cause of how this came about, I would say that the two most principal causes of this problem, as I said, there's the background of Islamist extremism, but the two principal causes are the fact that in Syria, Assad has been butchering his own people and acting as a recruiting sergeant to the extremists. And secondly, in Iraq, with the Maliki government, we had a government that did not represent all the people of Iraq. I thought in one of the most powerful interventions I've heard him make, Ban Ki-moon got it spot on when he said that, look, missiles can kill terrorists, but it is good governance that will kill terrorism. And we should have that thought front and back of mind as we debate this afternoon.
Grateful to the Prime Minister. Does he agree that the Iraqi government needs a political strategy to win over Sunnis and Kurds in their own country? And is he satisfied that they now know how to do it and will get full diplomatic support?
Well, in answer to the first part of his question, yes, it is absolutely essential. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. I met with President Abadi in New York and discussed this very directly with him. We need to make sure that the government in Iraq is not just supporting the Shia community, but is bringing together Shia, Sunni and Kurd in a united country with armed forces that are respected by every part of that community. That hasn't happened yet. It is happening, and I think that President Obama was absolutely right to delay this action until we had an Iraqi government with whom we can work as a good partner. What I'm going to do is make a little bit of progress with my speech, and then I will take several more interventions. So, as I've said, we have to take action at home and abroad, and as we take action abroad, it must involve using all the resources at our disposal. That means humanitarian efforts, which Britain is already leading, to help those displaced by ISIL's onslaught. It means diplomatic efforts to engage the widest possible coalition of countries in the region as part of this international effort. At the United Nations, we're leading the process of condemning ISIL, disrupting the flows of finance to ISIL, and forging a global consensus about preventing the movement of foreign fighters. Vitally, and as I've just been saying, this strategy also involves political efforts to support the creation of a new and genuinely inclusive government in Iraq, and to bring about a transition of power in Syria that can lead to a new representative and accountable government in Damascus, that it too can take the fight to ISIL. But yes, as one part of this comprehensive strategy, I do believe our military have an indispensable role to play, and in a moment or two I will turn to why. But let me take an intervention from the honourable gentleman first.
Thank the Prime Minister very much for giving way. Could he say more about this vital area of trying to change the nature of government in Syria and Iran's potential role in doing that?
Well, to be frank, what Syria needs is what Iraq needs, which is an inclusive democratic government that represents all of its people. Now, we have had our strategy in terms of that, backing the moderate Syrian opposition, the Syrian National Council, and working with others. But yes, I do think Iran has a role to play. I met with President Rouhani in New York to discuss this and other issues, and Iran can play a role in helping to bring about better government in both Syria and in Iraq. But, you know, the jury is still out as to whether they will play that role, but we should certainly be encouraging them to do that. I'll give way to my right honourable friend, and then my honourable friend, and then I'll make some progress.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I'm sure we're all also very grateful for the recall and the opportunity to discuss this in this manner today. My right honourable friend has mentioned Syria, and he's also mentioned that on the ground fighting ISIL as the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Iraqi army. Also fighting on the ground is the Free Syrian Army. Now, given that last week the United States Congress voted to support the Free Syrian Army overtly with weapons, given that they are conducting a ground war, which we are not prepared to do, would the Prime Minister, would my right honourable say whether or not we are looking again at whether we can give military hardware to the Free Syrian Army, because they have the people, they just don't have the weaponry to take on either Assad and ISIL together, because they have been doing that for the past year and need our help?
Well, as my right honourable friend knows, what we have done is support the Syrian National Coalition, support the Free Syrian Army with advice, with training, with mentoring and with non-lethal equipment. And I'm not proposing a change to that today. But let me address very directly this issue of ISIL in Syria. I'm very clear, ISIL needs to be destroyed in Syria as well as Iraq. And we support the action that the United States and 5 Arab states have taken in Syria. And I do believe there's a strong case for us to do more in Syria. But I did not want to bring a motion to the House today which there wasn't consensus for. I think it is better if our country can proceed on the basis of consensus. And of course, in this House, and I'm sure we'll hear this in the debate today, there are many concerns about doing more in Syria, and I understand that. I don't believe there is a legal barrier, because I think the legal advice is clear that were we to act or others to act, there is a legal basis. But it is true to say that the Syrian situation is more complicated than the Iraqi situation. It's more complicated because of the presence of the brutal dictator Assad. It's more complicated because of the state of the civil war. But we should be clear, we have a clear strategy for dealing with Syria, backing the official opposition, building it up as a counterpoint to Assad, and working for a transition. Because, as I've said, in the end, what Syria needs is what Iraq needs, which is a government that can represent all of its people. Let me give way to the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend.
For giving way, but does he accept that without the Iraqi army being able to take and hold ground, there is a real risk that airstrikes alone will not just prove ineffective, but could become counterproductive, especially if civilian casualties mount, and especially if ISIL actually uses the fact that they've withstood the might of the West and still held its ground, spins that story, which it has so far managed to do.
Yeah. Well, I would disagree with my honourable friend on this basis, that the air action that's already taken place by the Americans and to a degree by the French has already made a difference. Lives have been saved. Christians, Yazidis and other minorities who otherwise would be butchered has been saved by that action. Now, if my honourable friend is saying to me, do we need a better Iraqi army that is more capable on the ground? Yes, of course we do. But the truth is, because we quite rightly are not prepared to put our own combat troops on the ground, we should be working with the Iraqis, working with the Kurds, so they become more effective. But we can't wait for that and allow minorities and others to be butchered and for the risk to our own country to increase without taking action. Let me make some progress on why I believe military action is necessary before taking further interventions. Frankly, without it, I don't believe there is a realistic prospect of degrading and defeating Isil. And we should be frank, there already is a military conflict taking place. Isil have taken territory, they're butchering people in Iraq. Iraqi, including Kurdish security forces, are already fighting Isil. We have to decide if we're going to support them, and I believe that we should. If we are to beat these terrorists, it is vital that the international community does more to build the capability of the legitimate authorities fighting extremism, and along with our European partners, as has been discussed in this House, we're playing our role, supplying equipment directly to the Kurdish forces, we're strengthening the resilience of military forces in Lebanon and Jordan, and our Tornado and surveillance aircraft have already been helping with intelligence gathering and logistics to support American attacks on Isil in Iraq. But to be frank, and this is vitally important for the House to understand, the Iraqi government want more direct assistance. Earlier this week, the Iraqi foreign minister wrote to the United Nations Security Council requesting military assistance to support its actions. And when I met Prime Minister Abadi in New York on Wednesday, he reiterated that request to me. In Iraq, the real work of destroying Isil will be for the Iraqi security forces, but they need our military help, and it is in our interests and theirs to give it. Give way to the former Defence Minister.
There is a problem in Iraq, though, that we need to recognise, and it's not just political and it's not just capability. There needs to be a will from the Iraqi army to defend the Sunni areas of the country. Now, in his talks with the new government, has he seen that change? That actually means that our airstrikes will be supporting a country that has the will to defend all of its own people.
No, well, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and that is the conversation we're having with the Iraqi government. There's no doubt in my mind that this Iraqi Prime Minister is a change from the previous regime. They understand this point, but frankly, we should be tough in our interactions with them. They want our help, they want more training, they want more expertise, they want our counter-terrorism expertise to help them defend against these appalling car bombs in Baghdad. We should give them that help, but we should be saying, as we give them that help, this is conditional on you defending and protecting all of your people, and that must include the Sunnis in Iraq as well. Let me give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. The Kurdish president is on record as saying they do not want British servicemen and women on the ground fighting the fight for them. What they need is better equipment, training and the air support. Did Prime Minister Abadi deliver the similar message to our Prime Minister? And what is the situation vis-à-vis the Sunni tribes? Because they need to play a role in this, and they need to take the fight to ISIL as well.
No, well, my honourable friend is absolutely spot on. The Iraqi Prime Minister was very frank in his requests from me. He said very clearly in New York, we need your help to drive these people out of our country and indeed out of the world. And so he's very, very frank about that. We are supplying equipment to the Kurds. We can do more to help the Iraqi security forces. As for the Sunni tribes, yes, of course, we need them to help, but they need to see that they can be part of a successful Iraq. And that's why the involvement of other Arab countries is so important. And there are particular countries that may be able to encourage the Sunni tribes to take the step. Let me give way to my honourable friend, and then I'm going to make some progress.
Grateful to the Prime Minister, and I'm glad he seems to accept that airstrikes alone cannot hope to be successful unless they're in close coordination with credible ground forces. The only ground forces he's mentioned so far are those of the Kurds and the Iraqis. What are the other Arab states proposing to do? Because surely those ground forces have to be Sunni Muslim ground forces, and we need other Arab countries to supply them.
Now, I think my honourable friend makes an important point, but we should tread carefully here. We are proposing to act at the request of the legitimate Iraqi government. That government is supposed to represent all of its country, Shia, Sunni and Kurd. That country should be doing that rather than relying on other countries to provide Sunni forces in order to deliver that effect. And so I think it's very important that we keep the pressure, because it's the Iraqi government that should be representing all of its people rather than getting proxies to do it for it. Let me just specifically, I will give way, I'll take more interventions, I promise, but I want to answer this question, which is whether it is necessary specifically for Britain to take part in this international action. Should we just leave it to others? I don't believe that is the right answer. The coalition needs our help, in particular with the vital work being done in terms of airstrikes. Britain has unique assets that no other coalition ally can contribute. The Brimstone precision missile, which minimises the risk of civilian casualties and which even the United States doesn't have. We have our unique surveillance and intelligence capabilities. We have our highly professional forces which are well used to working with their US counterparts. These are some of the reasons why President Obama made clear to me that America wants Britain to join the air action in Iraq, which has now been underway for several weeks. But I believe, Mr. Speaker, it is also our duty to take part. This international operation is about protecting our people too, and protecting the streets of Britain should not be a task that we are prepared to entirely subcontract to other air forces of other countries. So it is right for us to act. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Grateful to him for giving way, but will he recognise that killing extremists doesn't kill their ideas? To the contrary, it can often feed their ideas, and for that reason, the former MI6 head of counter-terrorism has said that getting Saudi Arabia and Iran around a negotiating table will be far more effective than bombing. Why aren't we hearing far more from this Prime Minister about the political and diplomatic solutions to this, rather than reaching for the military solution, which could undermine them?
I mean, with respect to the Honourable Lady, we are taking those diplomatic initiatives. My right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, has recently returned from Saudi Arabia. I'm the first British Prime Minister in 35 years to meet with an Iranian president. We need all those political moves and those diplomatic moves to take place. They're absolutely vital. But in the end, there is a part of this that does require a military solution. ISIL have to be defeated on the ground, principally the work of the Iraqi security forces, but we can play a role as well. Let me give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Prime Minister. Many of those who we've heard speak against the action, and some of those who've contacted me, give voice to the fear of the consequences of action. But isn't it the point, and the reason that we are here recalled today, that the consequences of non-action, as I believe this House proved last summer, are far, far worse?
I think my honourable friend is right. What we have to weigh up is, of course, the consequences of action, and that is why I set up a National Security Council at which the heads of MI5, MI6, GCHQ and regularly the head of the Metropolitan Police attend and advise. But we've also got to think of the consequences of inaction. If we allow ISIL to grow and thrive, there's no doubt in my mind that the level of threat to this country would increase. We've already seen ISIL murderers butcher innocent people in a museum in Brussels. We've already had plots here in Britain by ISIL. How much stronger will they be before we decide we need to take action as well? We give way to the honourable gentleman.
ISIS indeed are made up of murderous psychopaths. That's not the issue. We know that. The question is, will what the Prime Minister and the government is proposing, will that be effective in destroying ISIS? Look at what the House of Commons agreed to. Iraq, Afghanistan, in this government, Libya, none are success stories. Are we going to embark on action that could last for years?
I will come on to why this is different to the decision the House made in 2003 about Iraq. But the fact is, this is about psychopathic terrorists that are trying to kill us, and we do have to realise that whether we like it or not, they have already declared war on us. There isn't a walk-on-by option. There isn't an option of just hoping this will go away. As I've just said, the plots are now. Let me turn. I will give way more. I promise the House I will give way more. I want to leave plenty of time for other contributions, but I want to turn directly to the question of legality. Mr. Speaker, the Attorney General has given his advice on the action we propose to take. There's a clear legal base for UK military action to help Iraq defend itself from ISIL. A summary of this legal position is being placed in the House of Commons library. Mr. Speaker, the Iraqi government has requested our help and given its clear consent for UK military action, so there can be no question about this. We have the letter from the Iraqi government to the UN Security Council, we have the public statements from Prime Minister Abadi and President Massoum, and we have the personal request made to me and the full UN Security Council by Prime Minister Abadi in New York on Wednesday. So there's no question that we have the legal basis for action founded on the request of the Iraqi government. Let me just briefly address the fact that we will be acting in the support of local partners. This has been a major concern of people across the House. We have a substantial international coalition in place, including Arab nations committed to confronting and defeating ISIL. 60 countries are acting in some way to help tackle ISIL. Of these, 10 are Arab states. 5 have already taken part in airstrikes with the Americans in Syria. And even regional powers like Iran are publicly condemning the extremists. Now, of course, as I've said, our differences with Iran remain. Iran's support for terrorist organizations, its nuclear program, the treatment of its people, I believe that all has to change. And we will not back down on these things. But if Iran's political leaders are prepared to help a more secure, more stable, more inclusive Iraq and Syria, we should welcome their engagement. Let me give way to my honourable friend.
On the question of the legal principle, clearly there is one, given the consent from the Iraqi government. But can the Prime Minister confirm that there is also the important principle of the responsibility to protect from genocide, which is on the table and capable of wider application?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. I mean, there are a variety of legal arguments that can be deployed. In this case, it couldn't be clearer. We're acting at the request of a sovereign state. And if we were to act in Syria, I believe that would be the legal basis too. Collective self-defense against ISIL, that threatens Iraq. But he's absolutely right, and I've said this in the House before, that it is a legal base. If you are averting a humanitarian catastrophe, then you can act. And let me be clear again, that although I think it's right we're having this debate and right having this vote, if there was a moment when it looked as if there could be an urgent humanitarian need for intervention, I would be prepared to order that intervention and then come to the House and explain why. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me explain. We have a comprehensive strategy for action. As I've said, we have a clear request from the Iraqi government. We have a clear basis in international law. We have a substantial international coalition, including many Arab partners, and we need to act in our own national interests. So I believe in answering the question about whether this is morally right, it is morally right that we now move to a new phase of action by asking our armed forces to take part in international airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq, and I believe we should do so now. Let me give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister in giving way. Muslims around the world have made it clear this has nothing to do with Islam, it's an evil organisation. Linked to that very point, has there been discussions with the 57 members of the OIC, the organisation of the Islamic Cooperation, which represents Muslim states, to see if many more of those Islamic countries will be joining this international coalition, along with the 5 Arab states, to ensure it's a wider, broader coalition and have the most effective outcome?
Well, all of these conversations were taking place this week at the UN General Assembly week. And I think it is one of the most important things that can happen is Muslim governments, Islamic countries across the world, is coming out and condemning ISIL and explaining that this is not a bunch of people acting on behalf of a religion. It is a bunch of psychopaths who have perverted a religion and that is not being done in their name. Let me address very briefly, and then I'll take some more interventions, what I believe a successful outcome would look like. We would want to see a stable Iraq and, over time, a stable Syria too. We want to see ISIL degraded and then destroyed as a serious terrorist force. But let me be frank, we should not expect this to happen quickly. The hallmarks of this campaign will be patience and persistence, not shock and awe. We're not deploying British combat troops, but we are providing air power in support of local forces on the ground. No British or Western troops will occupy Iraq. And there are many other elements that will be needed for a long-term success, many of which I have set out very clearly at this dispatch box today. Let me give way to the honourable member from the SNP.
Thank the Prime Minister for giving way. Listening closely to what he's saying, he's talked about the international coalition, but the Peshmerga fighters from the Kurds have taken a lot of the brunt of fighting ISIL in the first instance. Can he assure us that all the parties within Iraq also support this intervention, in particular the Kurdish political leadership?
What I can be clear about is, having spoken to the Kurdish leaders in Iraq and having spoken to the Iraqi Prime Minister, they've both been frank that they want our help. They've both said very clearly, we do not want British combat troops on the ground, but we do need the arms, we do need the ability to defeat this murderous terrorist organisation, and we are helping in exactly the way they would like us to help. Let me give way to the former Northern Ireland Minister and then to my honourable friend here.
I'm grateful. I support the Prime Minister's motion. I also think that in the end we have to deal with ISIL in Syria as well. But did I hear him correctly a moment or two ago? Did he say that if there was an urgent humanitarian need, he would take the action and then get subsequent support from the House? Surely it would be the other way around.
No. To be absolutely clear, the right honourable gentleman heard me first the first time round. If there was the need to take urgent action to prevent, for instance, the massacre of a minority community or a Christian community, and Britain could act to prevent that humanitarian catastrophe, if I believed we could effectively act and do that, what I'm saying is that I would order that and come straight to the House and explain afterwards. I think it's, let me be clear, I think the convention that has grown up in recent years, that the House of Commons is properly consulted and there's a proper vote, is a good convention, and I think it's particularly apt when there is, as there is today, a proposal for, as it were, premeditated military action. But I think it's important to reserve the right that if there was a critical British national interest at stake, or if there was the need to act to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, then you could act immediately and explain to the House of Commons afterwards. I'm being very frank about this because I don't want to mislead anybody. Let me give way to, sorry, the honourable gentleman first.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and it is very good that this House debates and votes before action happens. But can I press him, because he's often said there will be no boots on the ground. This motion is very, very carefully worded, slightly differently. Can he confirm whether or not he is asking the House to allow any presence of UK military personnel in Iraq, and if so, in what roles?
The reason for choosing the words combat troops is very important because, of course, when we were, for instance, contemplating putting in Chinook helicopters to evacuate the Yazidi people from Mount Sinjar, that would have involved British forces being in an area of Iraq with the servicing and the efforts and helping those helicopters. So it would have involved British personnel. So that is why we talk about British combat troops. I think we should be very clear about that. Let me give way to the honourable gentleman from Birmingham.
We're both from Birmingham, we get everywhere. I'm grateful to the Prime Minister. Whether or not we are militarily involved in Syria, there is no doubt that fighting in Syria has been and is intensifying. Now that will mean that the humanitarian crisis that has already been unfolding in Syria will also intensify. There's been over 650 major impact strikes on Aleppo, for example, since February. So this will require new ways of getting humanitarian aid in. What preparations are being made for that? Because the current arrangements need to be stepped up. And who is the Prime Minister and the international community cooperating with to ensure that that aid gets in?
No, well, I think the honourable gentleman raises an important point, and we have got a very advanced aid programme. Britain is the second biggest bilateral donor. We have been providing more aid across border, and we're working with all the international partners, as you'd expect, including this week increasing our aid contribution to make sure that happens. What I want to make some progress with my speech, and I'll take some more interventions. As I've said, what is required is an inclusive Iraqi government. We need a Syrian government that represents all its people. But I want to be frank with the House. Even after ISIL has been dealt with, we should be in no doubt that future British Prime Ministers and future British governments, I suspect, will be standing at this dispatch box dealing with this issue of Islamist extremism in different forms and in different parts of the world for many years to come. ISIL has sprung up quickly, but around the world we see the mayhem caused by other groups, whether that is Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in Yemen. We are dealing here with a generational struggle caused by the perversion of one of the world's great religions, Islam. But I have no doubt that this struggle is one which this House and this country is more than equal to. We give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way.
but General Dannett hinted today on television that you may well need to use ground forces at the end of the day, and it does take time to train the Iraqi army. If that were the case, will the Prime Minister come back to the House?
I've said we'll come back to the House if, for instance, we make the decision that we should be taking air action with others in Syria. But I'm not contemplating the use of British combat forces because I think it would be the wrong thing to do. I think the lesson to learn from previous conflicts is we should play the most appropriate role for us. It is for the Iraqi government, for an Iraqi army to defeat ISIL in Iraq, and indeed, in time, I hope, it is for a proper, legitimate Syrian government to defeat ISIL in Syria. Where we should be helping is with the aid, with the diplomacy, with the political pressure, and yes, with our unique military assets where they can help. But as part of a comprehensive strategy, not going over the heads of local people, not ignoring the regional powers, learning the lessons from the past. That is what this debate is about, that is what this motion is about, and that is why I believe we're taking the right steps. I'll give way to my honourable friend from North Wiltshire.
I'm most grateful, Prime Minister, for giving way. Would you not agree with me that the very careful wording of the motion before the House today is carefully done to make sure that we get support for it? Will you not accept that to some degree hamstrings the government? Is there not a place here for leadership and statesmanship rather than popular support of the House? He needs support of the country, but do we really need a vote on the matter?
Well, what I'd say to my honourable friend is that we live in a robust democracy where this House of Commons frequently demands and wants, quite rightly in my view, to see ministers at the dispatch box defending their actions and setting out, as I've just done, I think this now accepted convention that if there's going to be premeditated military action, the House of Commons should be consulted in advance. I've set out where I think there are gaps in that convention, and I couldn't have been clearer about it, and I think that probably has all parties' support. I'm going to take two more interventions and then I'll complete my speech. The Honourable Lady here.
I thank the Prime Minister. He has rightly talked about defeating ISIL militarily and politically, including with help in the region. Could he say something about how we need to also defeat them financially? Which countries are supporting ISIL, including by purchasing oil, and what is the British government and others going to do about it?
No, I think the Honourable Lady is absolutely spot on with this point. There are a number of things we need to do. First of all, action at the UN, which has now been taken to cut off the financial flows to ISIL. We need to take action to tell the world that ISIL, supposedly the enemy of Assad, is actually selling oil to Assad and making millions of pounds about it. American airstrikes have already dealt with some of the so-called mobile oil refineries that ISIL have been using to raise funds. But clearly there's more that needs to be done to persuade those that in the past might have backed organisations like ISIL because they were seen as a Sunni Arab organisation that they made a terrible mistake and they should not do it again. That was very much what was being discussed around the table at the UN Security Council and an issue I would support. I'm going to take one more intervention from the Honourable Member for Reading.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. I was going to raise the point about making sure that we can cut off funding to ISIL, but could he expand a little bit more on that in terms of what is going on in terms of the international pressure to make sure funding is squeezed on ISIL, because at the end of the day, this is a well-funded organisation currently, and by squeezing off the funding, we're going to make sure that they can't operate in the way they've been doing up until now.
My old friend is right. Part of the reason they have got hold of so much funding is because they have the oil, and also in some of the towns they took in northern Iraq, they simply took the money out of the bank. So it is going to be a long-term squeeze that has to be put on in this case. Let me give way finally to my honourable friend.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. Does he agree that if we are serious about tackling jihadi terrorism in the Middle East, we must take a much, much tougher line with some key allies, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, which have been fueling and funding terrorism for decades and continue to do so if reports are accurate?
What I'd say to my honourable friend is I think we need to have this very direct conversation with everyone in the Middle East, which is the dangers of this sectarianism of supporting groups because they're Sunni or because they're Shia. That is part of the background that has led us to this problem. And we need everyone to recognise, whatever branch of Islam they are from, that terrorism breeds further extremism and terrorism, and in the end comes back and damages their own countries and their own societies. Now, Mr. Speaker, it is inevitable that the shadow of the United Kingdom's last military involvement in Iraq hangs heavy over this chamber today. But the situation we face today is very different. We are acting in response to a direct appeal from the sovereign government of Iraq to help it deal with this mortal terrorist threat. It's a threat to Iraq and a threat to Britain. We are not acting alone, but as part of an international coalition of 60 countries, many of them from the region, and all of them committed to rolling back ISIL, however long and however difficult that task might be. Mr. Speaker, this is not 2003, but we must not use past mistakes as an excuse for indifference or inaction. We will play our part in destroying these evil extremists. We will support our Muslim friends around the world as they reclaim their religion. And once again, our inspirational armed forces will put themselves in harm's way to keep our people and our country safe. I pay tribute to their extraordinary bravery and service, and I commend this motion to the House.
Order. The question is the motion on Iraq. Coalition against ISIL. Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the government motion concerning military action against ISIL in Iraq. And it is right that the Prime Minister has brought this issue to the House and that he has committed that he will bring future decisions to the House too. Mr. Speaker, let me start by saying that all of us, whatever side of this debate we're on, will be conducting it with huge admiration for the bravery, spirit and the duty displayed by our armed forces who act on the decisions that this House makes. Let us be clear, Mr. Speaker, at the outset, what is the proposition today? It is about airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq. It is not about ground troops from the United Kingdom, nor about UK military action elsewhere. It is a mission specifically aimed at ISIL. Mr. Speaker, let me say, as we debate this issue today, I understand the qualms and for some deep unease there will be about this undertaking, both in the House and indeed in the country. Those who advocate military action today have to persuade members of the House not just that ISIL is an evil organisation, but that it is we, Britain, who should take military action in Iraq. I want to do so by setting out the particular nature of the ISIL threat. Secondly, the criteria we should apply to judging the case for military action. And thirdly, I want to say something about the role of our country in the world, which for me is directly relevant to this decision. I'll give way.
You also actually clarify Labour's position with regard to the politics. Many of us are concerned that there's no clear exit strategy militarily, but what about the politics in the sense that there's no point actually military intervention if the politics is not right, and it isn't. Many of those that served under al-Maliki are still in place. Many Sunnis still feel alienated, and without having the hearts and minds policy right, military intervention will not be enduring.
I understand the honourable gentleman's long-held caution on these issues. I think the point I will make in my remarks is there needs to be a comprehensive strategy. We're not talking about a military-only solution here. It is about political action, humanitarian action, and wider strategic action. I'll come on to that later on in my remarks. So first, Mr. Speaker, I want to say something about the nature of ISIL. As the Prime Minister said, ISIL is not simply another terrorist organisation. We've seen, of course, its hostage-taking of innocent British citizens. I will in a moment. And it's not just British citizens that ISIL are threatening. Christians, Yazidis, fellow Muslims, Sunni and Shia from many different countries and backgrounds. Anyone, Mr. Speaker, who does not subscribe to their deeply perverted ideology. I will in a moment. I want to just, if the House will allow me, give one hideous example recently gathered by Amnesty International, but it is directly relevant to the decisions we make today. On the morning of Friday the 15th of August, ISIL fighters assembled the residents of Kocho village in northern Iraq at the secondary school, where they separated men and boys from women and younger children. The men were then driven away to different nearby locations where they were shot and killed. The women and children of the village, of the village, were abducted and continue to be held by ISIL. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear about what this is. ISIL is murdering Muslims. So to those who say that military action against ISIL is somehow an attack on Islam, let me just say this. I understand the anxiety, including in communities in Britain, but the truth is entirely different. And it is Muslims themselves who are saying it. Leading British Muslim scholars and imams wrote this recently, and I quote, "They, ISIL, are perpetrating the worst crimes against humanity. It is a war against all humanity." So, Mr. Speaker, ISIL's ideology has nothing to do with the peaceful religion practiced by people across the world, billions of people across the world, and by millions of our fellow citizens who are appalled by their actions. I give way.
And I'm very grateful to the Leader of the Opposition. He mentioned the hostages. David Haynes was brought up and educated in Perth. Some of his family are constituents of mine. To the people of Perth, David Haynes is simply a hero. And the more we find out about his remarkable life, the more we're appalled by the means of his brutal and barbaric murder. The people of Perth are planning a commemoration to celebrate his life, and I'm sure that the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister want to join them and congratulate them in their efforts so that this man is properly remembered.
I think the honourable gentleman spoke with great eloquence on this issue, and in a way it tells us all we need to know about this organisation, that they would take hostage people who simply exist to try and help the innocent victims of conflict all around the world. I give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way and his support this time for the government motion for intervention. Given what he has said, about the horrors of ISIL, if it is necessary to come back to this House and have another motion to intervene against ISIL in Syria, will he support that motion?
Look, I do want to deal with this very directly, if the House will give me permission, and just be very clear about this. Look, we will obviously consider any further proposition if the Prime Minister so chooses to come back with it. Let me say 3 issues that concern me about the difference between Iraq and Syria. First of all, there is a question of legitimacy. Now, there is a strong argument about the legal base for action in Syria under Article 51. The point I've been making in the last few days is, in my view, when we're not talking about being invited in by a democratic state, it would be better, I put it no higher than that, but it would be better to seek a UN Security Council resolution. Now, why? Why? Because this is the highest multilateral institution of the world, and therefore it would be better to seek authorization on the basis of that. The other two issues that are in play here in relation to Syria are, one, the question of ground forces, because as a number of honourable members have made, is that we can't defeat ISIL by air power alone. Now, in the case of Iraq, it is the Iraqi army and the Kurds who can conduct those operations. There is, I put it no higher than this, there is an outstanding question about who will perform that function in Syria. And thirdly, as the Prime Minister himself made reference to, there is a big outstanding question about the overall outcome we are seeking in Syria. And personally, the Prime Minister said there is a clear strategy and plan in relation to that. I think a lot more work needs to be done on what exactly the route map is through in Syria. So those are the particular issues I raise in relation to Syria. I want to make some progress with my argument, Mr. Speaker, if the House will allow me. So ISIL is not simply a murderous organisation. As the Prime Minister said, it has ambitions for a state of its own, a caliphate across the Middle East, run according to their horrific norms and values. That's why I believe, establishing in the first part of my remarks, we cannot simply stand by against the threat of ISIL. But as I said in reference to the honourable gentleman, in acting against them, we need to learn the lessons from the past. And we should be clear about this with the British people. That means a comprehensive strategy, humanitarian and political, as well as military, and crucially rooted in the region. Now, some of this work is underway, but I believe much more needs to be done. But Mr. Speaker, there is a reality this House must face up to, which is to make this alliance work, there is a need for military action as well to contain and help counter the threat of ISIL in Iraq. That is why we are meeting today. So in the second part of my remarks, to make the case for military action by the UK, I want to return to the criteria I have previously set out, criteria which learn from the past and judge whether military action can be justified. First, Mr. Speaker, in any action we take, there must be just cause. I believe that ISIL does establish just cause, on humanitarian grounds that I've set out, and on grounds of national interest. On this point, the international instability that will be created by the undermining and potential overthrow of the democratic Iraqi state would clearly have implications for the stability of the region, and therefore implications for us and our national interest. And it would make it more likely that Iraq would become a haven and training ground for terrorism directed against the UK. Second, Military action must always be a last resort. And again, I believe this criterion is met. ISIL have shown they are not an organisation that could or should be negotiated with. Third, there must be a clear legal base to provide legitimacy and legal force to our actions. I support this motion today because we are responding to the request from the democratic Iraqi state, and this is recognised in the UN Charter.
And further to that point, would he not agree that in the case of Iraq, as someone who voted against the war in Iraq on March 18, 2003, we bear a particular responsibility for subsequent events, and therefore a particular responsibility towards the government and people of Iraq?
I think my honourable friend has an important point here. I'll come on to this later in my remarks, but some people would say that our intervention in Iraq means we should not intervene in this case. I think there is actually a heightened responsibility for us precisely because we did intervene in Iraq, and with all kinds of implications, the Iraqi state that has emerged is partly our responsibility. Let me move on to I will give way.
Right on, General, for giving way. Does he agree with me that this government has a moral obligation to help the Iraqi people in their hour of need, an obligation which, like the deficit, this government did not create, but this government's got to deal with?
I think if I may say so, the honourable gentleman did himself no credit with that intervention. Let me turn to the fourth test, Mr. Speaker. We must believe, and this is important, Mr. Speaker, but this is the hardest test of all, and we need to level with the House about this. We must believe there is a reasonable prospect of success before we take the grave step of committing our forces. And we should be clear with the House about this. The aim is clear, which is to reinforce the democratic government of Iraq, prevent the advance of ISIL at the invitation of that government. And it is to do so by using international military air power while the Iraqi army and the Kurdish Peshmerga conduct a ground campaign. Mr. Speaker, I will in a moment, but Mr. Speaker, this is an important point. Nobody should be in any doubt that this is a difficult mission and it will take time. But there is already evidence that the US action is having the effect of holding back ISIL. Prior to this action, ISIL was advancing with catastrophic consequences for the Iraqi people. This is where there is a choice to act or not to act, and both have implications and both have consequences. In June, ISIL took Mosul. Failure to act would mean more Mosuls and more killing of the sort that I described earlier. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful. If the outcome is greater stability and it requires the intervention and the support of neighbouring countries, does he agree with me that I would have quite liked to have heard more about Turkey's attitude, and also particularly Turkish attitude to arming the Kurds?
I think my honourable friend has a really important point, which is it is incredibly important that we mobilise all countries in the region, Turkey primary amongst them, because we need that. The whole lesson that we have here is that there's no solution without engaging not just the people of Iraq and an inclusive government in Iraq, but the wider neighbourhood as well. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to my fifth criteria. There must be broad support in the region for reasons of legitimacy, because this action must not be seen as some new form of imperialism, and effectiveness, because regional support is essential to the long-term success of the mission. Now, I will in a moment. Now, at the end of August, the Arab League made a statement calling for comprehensive measures to combat ISIL, and we now see a regional coalition of Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, as well as other countries. Sixth and finally, the proposed action must be proportionate. We must make sure that innocent civilians are protected, and I know there are strict conditions in place to ensure proper targeting and to do everything possible to avoid civilian casualties. So, Mr. Speaker, having scrutinised these 6 conditions, just cause, last resort, legal base, reasonable prospects, regional support and proportionality, I believe they are met. I'm going to give way to the honourable gentleman.
Leader of the opposition for giving way. When he talks about the broader coalition, would he agree with me and welcome the fact that 120 clerics and imams from around the world setting out sections of the Quran, making it quite clear this has nothing to do with Islam and that it is an evil organisation which everyone around the world, including the Muslim world, has a duty to tackle?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. This is not a clash of civilisations. There are the vast, vast majority of Muslims all around the world abhor ISIL and their activities. I will give way, yeah.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and congratulate him and the Prime Minister on what's been said so far today. It's absolutely vital that the sense that the entire House is behind our troops when they're out performing in this way is felt. But he's spoken very powerfully about how this isn't a war on Islam. We're all very conscious of the scars that remain from the past. Can he just say a little bit more about what he'll be doing as Leader of the Opposition to ensure that our Muslim communities here recognise this isn't a war on them and that it's absolutely about protecting Muslims as well as protecting people back here in the United Kingdom?
Well, I think my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, makes an incredibly important point, and it is, and I will play my part, as I'm sure he will, and my other honourable friends and honourable members from across this House, in setting out the case, explaining the basis of action, and indeed is to protect innocent Muslims in Iraq who are under terrible threat by ISIL day by day. And that is why there is urgency to this case. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister argued that this was a generational struggle, but only last year in this House, the Prime Minister passionately argued for action in Syria. Had he got his way last year, what would the position of ISIL be today? I ask openly, would ISIL not be stronger? And does this not show that even in the space of a year, the consequences were unforeseen and the commitment shouldn't be open-ended, but should be back to be under scrutiny from this House?
Well, I think it is incredibly important that on this occasion, as we seek the unity of the House, we do everything we can to make that happen. The proposition last year was about chemical weapons in relation to President Assad. Chemical weapons have been dealt with chemical weapons of President Assad have been dealt with by other channels. Of course, the situation in Syria remains very, very dire. I believe we made the right decision last summer, but I think today is about trying to get the whole House supporting this motion.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Does he recall that fairly recently the international community, including this House, was condemned for tolerating genocide in Rwanda and then tolerating genocide in Sudan? And today, given the evidence of genocide, particularly against the Kurds in Iraq, no wonder the British people are in support not just of him, but of the motion before the House.
I think my honourable friend speaks incredibly powerfully, and those examples are examples where many of us will feel that there was a case for intervention which was not taken up, and these decisions are always incredibly difficult. But if we can help innocent people who are under threat of persecution, I think it is right to do so. I give way.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right in supporting this motion, but could I press him on what he called our role is perceived in the world and how it's perceived by people outside? This hokey-cokey approach to international conflicts expresses concern amongst many people. We've just seen thousands of innocent Palestinians murdered while we stood on the sidelines. So can he commit to the House to show the same commitment and resources to pursue the government to get a satisfactory conclusion in Palestine?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend in the sense that it is right we speak out on these issues, and it is right we pursue the two-state solution that we need and speak out without fear or favour. I want to move on, if I may, Mr. Speaker, to the third part of my remarks. I just want to move on, if I may. Now, in the third part of my remarks, Mr. Speaker, I want to address this issue. Some people might accept the criteria I've set out, but say it is not our job to intervene because Western intervention always makes things worse. And I think we have to confront this issue directly because it will be a concern not just of people in this House, but of people in the country. I understand this argument, but I don't agree. Intervention always has risks, but a dismembered Iraq would be more dangerous for Britain, in my view, not less dangerous for Britain. ISIL unchecked, as my honourable friend said very powerfully, ISIL unchecked means more persecution of the innocent. And there is this point, Mr. Speaker. If we say to people that we will pass by on this one, it surely makes it far harder to persuade other Arab countries to play their part. Now, people across this House have been saying it's got to be done in the neighbourhood, we've got to engage the region, but if we say, well, I'm sorry, this has nothing to do with us, we're not going to intervene, it surely means that we have less moral authority to say we want you to play your part as well. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we should pride ourselves on our traditions of internationalism, because that is when Britain is at its best, being internationalist and not withdrawing from the concerns of the world. But Mr. Speaker, I want to say something about the underlying reasons for wariness, and I think we should confront it directly, and that is the 2003 war in Iraq. I understand why some who were in this House at the time will wonder if this is a repeat of that experience. In my view, it is not, and it's worth setting out why. First, as the Prime Minister said, this case is about supporting a democratic state. It is not about overturning an existing regime and seeking to build a new one from the rubble, a much harder undertaking. Secondly, there is no debate about the legal base for action in Iraq as there was in 2003. Thirdly, there is no argument about whether military action is a last resort. Whatever side of this debate we're on, nobody is saying let's negotiate with ISIL. They're not people you can negotiate with. Fourth, there is broad international support, not a divided world. All 28 EU member states and the Arab League providing support, and 5 Arab states taking part in action. And fifth, there is no question of British ground troops being deployed. So I understand the wariness there will be in the House and in the country about 2003 and whether this is a repeat, but on those 5 grounds, it is not, and it is demonstrably not. I give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he not agree that it is our failure to properly reconstruct Iraq after the war which actually increases our responsibility to act responsibly and engage other partners in the region to create a more stable country for future than we've seen over the last 10 years? Yeah.
I completely agree with my honourable friend about our responsibilities and indeed our responsibilities to the people of Iraq. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to give way again. Mr. Speaker, the late Robin Cook said in his resignation speech on the eve of the Iraq War this: "Our interests are best protected not by unilateral action, but by multilateral agreement and a world order governed by rules." Mr. Speaker, this is multilateral action, prompted by a legitimate democratic state. And a world order governed by rules, if it is about anything, must be about protecting a democratic state, which is what this motion before us is about. I believe, although this is difficult, it is the right thing to do. There is no graver decision for our Parliament and our country, but protecting our national interest, security, and the values for which we stand is why I will be supporting the motion this afternoon.
Sorry. Point of order. Was it a point of order? Point of order, Mr. Bill Wiggin.
Full, Mr. Speaker, you have noticed. My constituents expect me to be able to get into the chamber and hear my Prime Minister. No such obligation rests on this poor man behind me. Will you find a safe place for this camera crew so that he can film without getting in our way?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. As far as I can see, the camera crew is certainly not interfering with the business of the House, and everybody is safe. I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order, to which I have responded. Order. Can I just point out to the House that no fewer than 77 honourable and right honourable members are seeking to catch my eye, in consequence of which colleagues will understand my decision to impose with immediate effect a 5-minute limit on backbench speeches. Sir Richard Ottaway.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition for the constructive and measured way in which they have introduced this debate today. Mr. Speaker, this intervention is different in 2 respects. For the first time, war is being used. War is fought using social media as a tool. The power of the internet is becoming increasingly apparent. We've all been shocked by this slick propaganda. For most of us, the first we heard of ISIL was through YouTube. Mr. Speaker, this is the world that we live in today. The second is the young age and radicalism of our opponents. Albert Einstein once said, "Old men start wars, but younger men fight them." Well, not any longer. The ISIL and Al-Qaeda commanders are in their 30s, and the old men are the refugees.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I do.
My honourable friend makes a very important point, and one of the most powerful weapons, of course, is social media that ISIS has been using. What does he think governments around the world, like ours and like the US, should be doing to make sure that social media is not being used and that sites are being blocked and actually IS is stopped from getting their publicity out there in the domain?
I agree with my honourable friend. I think he's answered his own intervention. I think the government should be addressing this and recognising that soft power is now a tool of war and is something that should be addressed very seriously indeed. But, Mr. Speaker, I was saying that our opponents are young and radical. Up against them are the slow, clunking democracies of the West and the civilised world. But these democracies are our strength. This building, our electoral mandate, they give us a legitimacy that ISIL and similar rebel groups will never have, and that is what will ultimately undermine them. I do.
Giving way. He makes a very important point. Of course, an important part of all this, alongside the military action that I hope we will endorse today, is the soft approach, is the diplomatic record of the United Kingdom's relationship with many of the Sunni tribes that are in the area that ISIL have control over now. Isn't it important to recognise that ISIL, with their use of social media and their very strong media operation, are effectively an opportunist front for what has been a civil war? And we must make sure we can't negotiate with ISIL, but we do negotiate and talk to those people from the Sunni communities within the tribes in that area.
I agree with the honourable member, and indeed he anticipates what I'm coming to in my speech. But, Mr. Speaker, the Western world agonises about how to respond intelligently and responsibly to these violent threats. And I congratulate the Prime Minister for the rational and measured way he's assessed the situation and for the leadership that he has shown. A coalition of the willing has been assembled. The response has been prepared. And, Mr. Speaker, our thoughts are now with the men and women of the armed forces. This isn't going to be an easy campaign. It's going to be messy. It's going to be untidy. And there will, I fear, be fatalities. But this intervention is the very least that a country such as Britain and the United Kingdom should be doing. We're a world leader in the EU, in NATO, and the G8. We hold down a permanent seat in the Security Council in the United Nations. And we derive benefit from all of these positions. But it also gives us responsibilities, and we have a duty to act. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, it is of some regret to me that whilst I recognise the politics, that we're not authorising action in Syria today. The border between Syria and Iraq has virtually disappeared. It is a sea of human misery. There is open cross-border movement of people, both legal and illegal, military organisations, innocent citizens, homeless, terrified refugees. It is a seamless conflict over two countries covering thousands of miles and presenting a vulnerability in ISIL's stretched resources, which we are not capitalising on. I won't if he doesn't mind. We've long encouraged the Arab states to get involved. Now they are, and the irony is that we're pulling our punches as they do. This is the first time that there has been an international coalition in Syria, and we should be a part of it. And the leader of the opposition said in his speech that he thought it would be better if a resolution was tabled at the United Nations before intervening. Given that Russia has already said it will veto such a resolution, it is incumbent on the leader of the opposition to say then what his position would be. So what is the hesitation over Syria? We will never end this conflict by turning back at the border. And perhaps the Deputy Prime Minister who winds up the debate could say what is the role for the Free Syrian Army, which has just been given $500 million by the US Congress to equip its fight. They have been fighting ISIS for months, and like the Peshmerga in northern Iraq, they're fighting for their homeland. And we're all agreed that air attacks alone aren't going to bring this war to an end. ISIS will clearly go underground, and it will need forces on the ground to ram home the advantage that air cover provides. We all accept that there aren't going to be British or American boots on the ground, but the Peshmerga are willing. The Free Syrian Army is willing. They have strong contacts with each other, and they stand shoulder to shoulder in their exchanges. It won't if he doesn't mind. Strategically, it makes sense to bolster moderate forces to take the fight to ISIL. And this, Mr. Speaker, means supplying funds and equipment to the Free Syrian Army. They have shown themselves to be reliable partners over a sustained period of time. But in the longer term, this will strengthen their anti-Assad capability and bring him to the negotiating table, something that we've been talking about for over 3 years. And no one should be under any illusion that the attacks on innocent citizens in Syria remain 99% the work of the Syrian regime. They've now killed an estimated 170,000 people of their own people against just a few hundred by ISIL. Mr. Speaker, war is a terrifying business, particularly to those who have experienced it. On occasions, it's a necessary evil, but no matter how necessary, it is always ghastly and horrendous. It is with a feeling of depression and trepidation that I will be supporting the government tonight.
Mr. Peter Hayne. Speaker, although I support this motion authorising military strikes on ISIL in Iraq, and although I fully support my party leader's caution over extending it to Syria without UN backing, the blunt truth is that simply allowing ISIL to retreat across an invisible border to them, which they control, into Syria and regroup is no answer. But first, why British military action against ISIL's barbarity but not Assad's butchery? And anyway, shouldn't the haunting, ill-fated legacy of invading Iraq instruct us to stay well clear? In the cabinet in 2003, I backed Tony Blair over Iraq because I honestly believed Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. I was wrong. He didn't. We went to war on a lie, and the aftermath was disastrous, which has made me deeply allergic to anything similar in the region, certainly anything remotely hinting of cowboy Western intervention.
Doesn't my right honourable friend also accept that the intervention in 2003 was welcomed by a lot of the people of Iraq, and in particular the Kurds?
I agree absolutely with my honourable friend. But even Libya, supposedly a surgical operation consented to by this House in 2011, is hardly a good advertisement for us, with chaos now in the country. In the Syrian... Yes, of course.
The right honourable gentleman, and in supporting the motion, as indeed I think broadly we are across the House, is one of the lessons from the 2003 intervention in Iraq that we should have designed in the reconstruction of Iraq as a democratic state from the outset, rather than leaving it until after we'd achieved some military effect.
Indeed, and we tried to, but the Americans took no notice, frankly. In the Syrian horror from which ISIL has sprung, of course Assad's forces have unleashed waves of terror, but his jihadist opponents too have committed terrible atrocities. That's the context which has given birth to ISIL, not because this House prevented the Prime Minister from armouring moderate rebels in the Free Syrian Army. Had the Prime Minister got his way last August, where might those British arms have ended up? Probably with ISIL. Instead of trying to bounce Parliament into backing military strikes in Syria last August 2003, we should have been promoting a negotiated solution right from the beginning. This was always going to be the only way to get Assad, and more important, his backers, to shift towards compromise. Because Syria never was some simplistic battle between evil and good, between a barbaric dictator and his repressed people. It's a civil war, a quagmire into which Britain should tread at dire peril. At its heart, the incendiary internal Islamic conflict, Sunni versus Shia, and their chief protagonists and sponsors, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, and also a Cold War hangover, the US with all its considerable military and intelligence assets in the region versus Russia with its only Mediterranean port and intelligence capability in Syria. Even more crucially, Assad is backed by 40% of his population. His ruling Shia-aligned Alawites, fearful of being oppressed by the Sunni majority, along with the Kurds, the Christians and other minorities. They don't like his repressive Ba'athist rule very much. They fear the alternative even more, becoming victims of genocide, jihadism or Sharia extremism. Assad was never going to be defeated militarily, and he isn't now. That's the truth. And if Western military intervention had somehow toppled him, without a settlement in place, violent chaos in the Syrian quicksand would still have ensued. The Arab League envoy Lakhdar Brahimi, along with the UN, set out a political solution which should always have been the imperative. And that means negotiating with Assad's regime and with the Russians and Iranians standing behind him. Our failure to undertake this is a major reason why the civil war, in my view, has been so prolonged and why ISIL has been allowed to flourish. Medieval in its barbarism and its fanatical religious zeal, which views its own narrow Wahhabi sect dating from the 18th century as possessing the sole truth, it uses that as the justification for exterminating both all its opponents and any other religious group blocking their way to establishing a caliphate. It has to be stopped. And Britain has the military surveillance and intelligence capabilities which those on the front line fighting ISIL do not. In northern Iraq, only US air power, at the request of the Iraqi government, the Kurds and the minorities facing genocide by ISIL's remorseless advance, and very significantly, with a military participation of half a dozen nearby Arab countries, has knocked back ISIL's well-equipped army. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. That Iran gave its de facto, if covert, blessing is of significance, opening an opportunity for future engagement and collaboration which could be transformative for the whole region, Israel, Palestine included. Britain should also help local Iraqi and Kurdish forces fighting ISIL with airstrikes, drones, military equipment and other support, but not with troops on the ground. Countries in the region have to take ownership of this battle because ISIL threatens them all. But the elephant in the room for me remains Syria. ISIL will never be defeated if it is constantly allowed to regroup from its Syrian bases. Without either UN or Syrian government authorization, airstrikes in Syria may be illegal, although they could well be justification under international law for such strikes, even without UN agreement. And UN authority for airstrikes in Syria won't be granted without Assad and Putin's agreement, maybe President Rouhani's too. That's very difficult. To many very distasteful, but very necessary, because what is the alternative? Although Syria's Russian-supplied air defences have been hit by the fighting, they're quite sophisticated. Even the US had to pre-inform Damascus about the timing and location of its airstrikes this past week or so. Yet engaging doesn't mean befriending, rather akin to Churchill in 1941, who said, "If Hitler invaded hell," he told his private secretary, "is Germany ready to invade Stalin's Russia? I would at least have made a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." Handled sensitively, this could be an opportunity, and I urge the Prime Minister to take it, to kickstart a proper Syrian peace process and to diffuse the long-standing, deep and inflammatory divisions amongst Muslims in the Middle East. Iranians are Shiites sponsoring Hezbollah and other militias, Saudis and Qataris as Sunnis sponsoring al-Qaeda and other jihadists, including ISIL, where they've helped unleash a monster which threatens to devour them all. By acting carefully, not bombastically, by making common cause with both Saudi Arabia and Iran to confront a common ISIL enemy, Britain could possibly even help realign Middle East politics to overcome the bitter and violently corrosive Sunni-Shia fault line in the region. A big ask, Mr. Speaker, an even bigger task, but an immensely valuable one.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's any significant controversy about the moral and legal case for what is proposed, and in 5 minutes I won't set them out. The world would be a better place if ISIS was destroyed, and Britain would be a safer country, without doubt. I do think the legal case for intervention in Iraq is clear, with the government inviting us. I think it's pretty clear in Syria because of the genocide and the humanitarian disasters being inflicted on that country. And I do agree that it's artificial to divide the two problems. The Sykes-Picot line is a theoretical line on the map now, and there's absolutely no doubt that ISIS has to be defeated in both countries. Yes, certainly.
I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend. Given that one of the principles of counterinsurgency is to deny the enemy a home base, isn't it absolutely essential that we back the American efforts in Syria? Otherwise, we will never defeat them in Iraq. And for people to suggest that we can't go to Syria is actually tying our hands behind our backs.
I agree with my honourable friend. President Obama, I think, has been quite open that he is going to, this alliance we're joining, is going to actually launch attacks on ISIS in both Syria and Iraq, and it is quite unrealistic to proceed on any other basis. So the real debate, which I briefly would like to contribute to, which I think divides is the only issue for the vast majority of people in this House and for the vast majority of our constituents, is where are we going, what is the long-term purpose, what is the strategy, how is our foreign policy, our politics and our diplomacy going to be better on this occasion than it's been for the last 15 years. The disaster of past occasions is not that we attacked pleasant regimes. We attacked evil men when we attacked Hussein, when we got rid of Gaddafi, when we attacked Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and if we'd attacked Assad's nuclear chemical installations last year. The problem, and this is no good going back, I supported two of those, Libya and Syria last year, and I was dubious about one of the others, and I opposed Iraq. That isn't the point. What happened was, in all those cases, that the military deployment produced a situation at least as bad as it had been before, and actually largely worse. We did not create... No, I have no time, I'm sorry. We did not create extremist jihadism. We did not create these fanatic fundamentalist pressures, but we made things worse and made it easier for them to spread by some of our interventions. So we all agree we must not repeat that. We need to be reassured, and I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, on his speech, where actually he spent the very great deal of his time trying to reassure. And I'm left with the feeling that certainly I should support this motion because some of our best allies are taking part in this intervention. But I still think we're at the early stages of working out exactly where we're going. And I do think that our almost symbolic participation in these military attacks, I mean 6 aircraft in our intelligence are no doubt valuable to our allies, but we're symbolically joining with them. The main hope I have is it gives us a positive influence on the diplomacy and the unfolding politics that have to take place to try to get together what again seems to be agreed on all sides is necessary, is the widest possible participation and settlement between the great powers of the region in order to get what we all want, lasting stability and security in what at the moment is a very dangerous region of the world. I congratulate those responsible, Americans no doubt, for getting the Sunni allies and the Arab states into what is taking place, which makes a big difference from previous occasions. But all these things have problems. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, other Arab states actually support other extremist Islamist organizations, Sunni organizations, and they have to be persuaded not to. ISIS is the worst of the Sunni threats to the region, but it's not the only one, and their enemies include Al-Qaeda, but other groups as well. The participation of the Shia is even more problematical because there's no real Shia engagement. And that takes us on to the crucial matter of Iran. A lot of what is taking place in this region is a proxy struggle for power between Iran and the Shiites and the Saudis and the Sunni, and we revived ancient sectarian warfare which most sensible Muslims, the vast majority, hoped were long since dead. Iran is a key influence because it is actually a close patron of Assad in Syria, of Hezbollah, and of the Shiites in Iraq, including the Shiite militia, who are the only effective armed force at the moment for the so-called Iraqi government. Somebody has got to get the Iranians and the Saudis closer together to support moderation and to decide what stability replaces things. The Kurds we ally ourselves with, which I'm delighted to see, but their aim of Kurdistan makes problems for Turkey, and Turkey is a key ally as well if we're going to make any progress. So I congratulate the Prime Minister on addressing all these, meeting Rouhani for the first time. I wish him well over several years that are going to come, because no genius is going to solve this problem in a very short time.
Isil Blairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Before I make my contribution today, I wanted us all just to take a moment, if we can, just to think about and to pray for the hostages who are currently being held by IS, the hostages who have been murdered in the most horrific circumstances, and I want us particularly, Mr. Speaker, to think today about Alan Henning. Alan is a taxi driver from Eccles in Salford. He's not my constituent, but he lives very, very close indeed to where I live at home. And I know that Alan and his wife and his family are being held in the thoughts and prayers of everybody in my city, everybody across this country, and I hope also by everybody in the House. Alan went out to Syria on a humanitarian mission. He went out to give aid to the men and women and children and babies who were being slaughtered in Syria. He was there as an ambassador from our country, and I would just make a personal plea today to the people of IS, whether it falls on stony ground or not, that they should release him. He should come home to be with his wife and his family and the people who love him. Mr. Speaker, there will be a lot said today about military power, about airstrikes, about troops on the ground.
Friend before she moves on. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend because, and I associate entirely, as I'm sure the House does, with her remarks about hostages. But I think we also need to be very careful about language, because when we talk about humanitarian intervention and mean military intervention, it also does put at risk those people who are doing purely humanitarian work.
My honourable friend, as ever, makes a good point, and I think there can be absolutely no doubt that Alan was there on a mission of mercy and support. There will be a lot said today about military action, and I can make it clear at the outset that I support the terms of the motion. Personally, I think the motion is rather a minimalist motion, and I have no doubt that in the future we will have to return to this issue and we will have to debate it again. I agree with my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the member for Neath, that in fact if we simply take action in Iraq, then IS, no doubt, will go back into Syria and we will be faced with some very serious problems.
Would my honourable friend allow me on that point? Like lots of other people, I think we may well end up having to go into Syria as well. But what I want to know is, if that happens, how are we going to ensure that bombing in Syria doesn't have the perverse effect of strengthening Assad, which the Prime Minister has said is one of the begetters of ISIL in the first place? Aren't we going to have a much more sophisticated strategy than just bombing in Syria?
Again, my honourable friend makes an absolutely relevant point, and I think most of us who've been involved in these issues for some years have seen sometimes the unintended consequences of action that we've taken, and that's why a far-sighted strategy about what we do, what the impact will be, how we build resilience, how we build coalitions, and how we take that forward will be absolutely essential. And I wanted at this point really to thank the Prime Minister for the work that he has done in building the alliances, building the coalition, because I think that's a significantly different place that we're in today than we were in years past. And I think that the idea that the West on their own, America and Britain, can take a war to the Middle East is completely wrong. And the idea that it's the states on the ground who have a personal responsibility for the safety of their own region to take this action with our support and with our backing, but it's absolutely the right place to be. And I know how difficult it is to build those alliances, and I wanted to add my thanks to that. But what I really wanted to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is not the military action. I want to talk about the causes of terrorism, and I've mentioned that many times in this House. I think that unless we deal with the root cause, the poisonous ideology that's being promulgated by the extremists that seeks to get vulnerable young people and groom them, and that's a very clear word, groom them into this extremism, then we will be back here time and time and time again. And now is the moment at which we need to be really serious about this agenda. The latest estimate is 3,000 people simply from the European European Union going out to fight in Iraq and Syria. That's young, vulnerable men and women. People can be radicalised in all kinds of environments. They can be radicalised at home by their family. They can be radicalised in a youth centre. They can be radicalised increasingly on the internet and social media. Indeed, they can be radicalised sometimes in religious institutions. But it's very interesting, Mr. Speaker, that the estimate from the Home Office at the moment is less than 2% of radicalisation is being carried out in religious institutions. It's actually happening in those ungoverned spaces that are part of every single one of our community. Briefly.
I thank her for giving way. Will she put on record her interest in the work that the group, the Active Change Foundation from Walthamstow, who not only set up the Not in My Name campaign that both the Prime Minister and the President of the United States have talked about, but also are working to do exactly the kind of work she's talking about and we should do more of?
Yeah, I'm delighted to place on record my appreciation for her organisation and her commitment. I wanted to come to the Prevent strategy, and we've debated that across this chamber many times. And in fact, in his statement on the 1st of September, the Prime Minister said, and I was delighted he said this, "We should be clear about the root cause of this threat, a poisonous ideology of Islamist extremism, a warped worldview. We should be clear this has nothing to do with Islam." And I'm grateful for that. I'm also grateful for the many statements that religious people in this country have made, imams have made, when we've seen the atrocities, and we're now beginning to move from condemnation into a proper narrative about the fact that it is not justified by the religion. But I think we have a long, long way to go on this. And I would just urge the Prime Minister to be braver, to be more courageous, to say that we need to support credible scholars to develop a view of Islam in a modern 21st century democracy where Muslims are in a minority that is more relevant to everyday life, that again will protect and build the resilience of those young people. It's difficult work. You'll be accused of trying to tell people what to believe in their religion, which is no place for a government to be in a democracy, but it's work that's urgent and needs to be done. I would ask him and the Home Secretary to come back to this House with a proper plan for how we are going to conduct the counter-narrative on the ideology. We have RICU in the Home Office. It's small. It's not doing the kind of effective work that it can do. It needs to be bolstered. And again, it needs to take in the best ideas from around the world, from all of our partners, to build this narrative in a practical way so that we can show people that this is not the future for our country. I'm afraid I don't have time. I would always give way to my honourable friend, but I don't have time. I just wanted to give two examples as to why this work is so important. Members will have probably seen in the newspapers today the case of Samira Salih al-Nuaimi, who was a human rights lawyer in Mosul. She has been taken, she was brought before a Sharia law court, she was tortured for 5 days, she was sentenced to public execution, and she was murdered on Monday. She was a brave human rights lawyer. That's what a caliphate is. That's what this ideology is. It's medieval, it's about human trafficking, it's about exploitation. And then we have people in this country like the young man from Brighton, whose mum said he was brainwashed. I had no idea. I don't want other people to follow him. That's the reason. I want to see the Prime Minister back in here with a proper counter-narrative ideology plan, and I will support him.
Miss Campbell.
I too remember the speech made by Robin Cook in 2013. I remember it with great admiration and perhaps a little emotion. Not least, of course, because he resigned from the government because of his views, and he then joined the rest of us who voted against his own government in the lobby that evening. But this is not 2013. This is not 2003, I beg your pardon. It's an entirely different set of circumstances. And of course, an important feature of the different set of circumstances is the fact that we would be responding to a request made by the lawful government of Syria. A government concerned to ensure our... of Iraq. I have Syria on the brain, and I'll come back to it in a moment. The lawful government of Iraq. A government whose very existence, and indeed the existence of the country for which they are responsible, is undoubtedly at stake. And there is a legal basis, in my view, there is a legal basis beyond any question that's been referred to by many of those who've spoken already for what we are being asked to endorse today in the House of Commons. Yes, I'll give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Given that airstrikes alone will not achieve victory over ISIS, who has the plans and the determination to win on the ground now?
That, I hope, is the product of the alliance which the United States, through President Obama, and also the efforts of Senator of State John Kerry, have been putting together. And as an illustration of that commitment is the fact that 5 countries in the region have joined in support of the airstrikes which have been taken so far. I'll come back to the question, if I may, about the long term. Now, if the honourable gentleman will... I'm afraid I must move on. No, I'm very sorry. I'm afraid I must move on. I'm afraid I must move on. The point I want to make is this, that we are faced with circumstances in relation to Iraq in which its very survival is at stake. And it's important that we should exercise a degree of responsibility in this matter, because, of course, although it's not the sole cause of the circumstances in Iraq at the moment, there is no doubt that the military action in which we joined with the United States against Saddam Hussein has been a major contributor to the circumstances we now find ourselves in. Let me deal with the question of Syria. I'm content that were there to be a motion to the effect that we should take similar action in Syria, there exists a proper and sound legal basis for that action. Indeed, the very factors which justify intervention in Iraq would be of equal weight in relation to Syria. And these, of course, are, to put it shortly, the kind of barbarism which is being displayed, the fact that the regional stability is being heavily undermined. And just let's remind ourselves, some of that undermining of stability has an impact upon countries, for example, like Jordan, a close ally and indeed a necessary component were there ever to be a global settlement for peace in the Middle East. It's also to be recognized that those Arab countries which have joined in, they have exercised a degree of responsibility in doing so. In many cases, they are taking on elements within their own countries which would otherwise be opposed. How would any other country faced with that decision feel in the event that this motion were not to be passed? And when you have, as has been suggested, that we need a United Nations resolution before we could embark on anything of the kind now proposed, or indeed in relation to Syria, you have to accept the reality that the prospect of a United Nations Security Council resolution is totally remote. Indeed, even putting one on the table would be a wholly pointless exercise because of the attitude undoubtedly to be taken in Russia and possibly also by China. But may I move on to a point which I think is of some of the language which has been used so far has been about destruction. I'm not sure it's possible to destroy an ideology. I'm not sure it's possible to destroy a cult of the kind which we see now exercising such malign influence. But one thing you most certainly can do, and that is to adopt containment and deterrence. And to do that, you have to degrade the military capability. You have to create circumstances in which any return to barbarism will be met by swift and effective action. And I think we would be better agreeing that we're not likely to embark upon a successful process of destruction, but that we can have an effective doctrine of deterrence and containment. There's no parallel between the Iraq debate of 2003, but there is a parallel with Kosovo, because when Kosovo was an issue, with very similar considerations like those that we are concerned with, not least, of course, with ethnic cleansing, then the international community, without a resolution, found itself able to deal with that. Lot's been said about the long term. We don't have that luxury. The urgency is to be found in the...
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's so easy to despair. In politics, especially, how often do we obsess about the small differences rather than the biggest challenges? Too often we are interested by the internal workings of Westminster power and we stop looking outwards. We turn away from the world and inwards on ourselves. That's a mistake. Our country is internationalist in outlook. To us, all people matter, like our neighbours matter and our family matters. People in Iraq matter. This conflict has innocent victims scared out of their homes, women, men and children who take no part in violence but who will lose the most. Isil have executed a murderous, disastrously effective campaign of violence. The summer has seen them take control of Iraqi cities, exploiting the fragile politics to terrorise, devastating morale and showing that Isil has a serious stock of military equipment that they are prepared to use to attack indiscriminately. They must be stopped. I will get...
Lord Stewart. Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. In the last 20 years, the United Nations has moved. It is now a responsibility on members to deal with genocide when it occurs in the world. And that doesn't, in my view, require a Security Council resolution. We need to do something when people are threatened in this world.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. I'll say more about internationalism shortly. Of course, some people will say, this is not our fight. Leave it to those closer by. For those who feel strongly, it's tempting to offer a counsel of despair and walk away. It's so much harder to set about dealing with violent threats in a context that is complicated and where risks are high. In response, I say, we all want peace. The only question is how. The UK should not dictate the answer to this violence or carelessly interfere, but that does not mean turning your back whilst violence persists. In answering the question, should we do anything or nothing, we have to ask ourselves what good we can do. In answer, conflict in the Middle East. I give way to me.
Diane Abbott. Doesn't my honourable friend accept that no one is talking about walking away? The only argument is bombing the way to resolve the long-standing political problems in Iraq and the region?
As I said, Mr. Speaker, in answering the question, should we do anything or nothing, we have to ask ourselves what good we can do. In answer, conflict in the Middle East seems to invite comparisons. Yet while we should learn from history, the search for patterns, repetitions, can be misleading. There's no reason why the future should necessarily be like the past. In fact, it's our job to make sure that the future is not like the past. And those facts are, as I have said, Isil are a serious and growing force wreaking havoc on the Iraqi government and innocent people. The Iraqi government have asked us to help. We have the capacity to do so. Our government have made their aims clear. The leader of the opposition has set the right tests. We in this House must offer scrutiny as best we are able to do and make more likely the success of this operation. And a vital factor in the success of this operation will be cutting off the financial supply, as my friend, the member for Leicester West, said earlier. There was a United Nations Security Council resolution on this point on the 14th of August, and it would be helpful to know what progress has been made so far. But there are some other facts that matter too. This is not just a matter of security, vital though that is. There is also the question of politics and development. We need more than just a military response. Peace requires not just the absence of violence, but for other needs to be met too. Both basic needs to keep the vulnerable alive, but for all of those affected to see a way out of this conflict. In the past, the UK, via the Department for International Development, has put reasonably substantial sums into development-focused assistance for Iraq. This ended in 2012 when the bilateral programme ended. However, this year, there has been a budget from DFID for Iraq of over 25 million, but only 4.3 million has been spent so far. So I would ask whether we need to increase efforts to make sure that money committed can be spent effectively and soon. And we also need to ask whether this is enough support. By way of comparison, we spend around 75 million this year in Syria and a similar sum in the Yemen. I want to make two further brief points about development. Firstly, on long-term needs. This budget is for a single 12-month Iraq Emergency Humanitarian Assistance Programme to help 65,000 ordinary Iraqis in serious need, providing emergency medicines, food, basic shelter, and to reunite families. But at what point can we see more longer-term development assistance going to Iraq, not just humanitarian assistance? Not just emergency aid, but more to support the wider developments for those who are victims of conflict. I'd like to know if the government have discussed this possibility internationally. And I'd like to ask ministers if they know how many children are losing their education due to this conflict. Schools in the Kurdish region are being used for shelter, which is right, of course, but it means so many are losing out their chance and their hope for the future. Also, what's the risk to wider healthcare needs? The Iraqi government must be supported to maintain not just hard infrastructure that the country will need, power, transport and water, but also the vital infrastructure of public services. Development assistance must work alongside military answers to ISIL. I'd like to know if the Minister, if DFID are working alongside the military in their planning. Secondly,
chatter in the House, which is frankly discourteous. All colleagues should be heard with courtesy. Please let's do so. Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, I want to ask about refugees. In the context of Syria, we were able to help a handful of the most vulnerable refugees to take refuge here in our country, and I'd like to ask if we can do more. This is the most colossal refugee crisis we have now, and as a country we must live up to our obligations and to our moral duty to help those who have done nothing to cause and are innocent victims of this conflict. I would finish, Mr. Speaker, by just saying this. Victims of violence in Iraq need our help and our military assistance, but our job is far bigger than that. We must also now try, limited though our power is, to win the peace.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, it is very clear the threats that ISIL pose. The humanitarian outrages they have already perpetrated have been on our TV screens and our newspapers. They threaten the destabilisation of the region and the threat, frankly, of an all-out religious war. And they will be global exporters of jihad if we allow them. So the question to act or not act is a relatively simple one. But in choosing to act, we have to act politically, we have to act economically and militarily, all in concert. Politically, we need full and greater regional support than we've had even up till now, and that includes Turkey, which is a key player in the region, and let's remember, a strong NATO ally. I'll give way in a moment. We also need a very clear view from the regional powers exactly what the political shape they want to achieve in the region is. Because the lesson we learned from Iraq, if anything, is that military victory, even where it's possible, is only the beginning of a much more difficult process. I give way.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. And he mentioned Turkey. Does he not agree with me that countries, including Turkey, Cyprus and others in the region, need to be doing much more to disrupt the flow of fighters from Europe and elsewhere into Iraq and Syria, and indeed possibly their transit back to here?
Speaker, it is the duty of all those who wish to see international order maintained to do everything that is possible within their powers to disrupt the flow of exactly such movements. The second point, Mr. Speaker, is that all conflicts are ideological, and this conflict is no different. And we require political and religious leaders in the region to be much more vocal about the fact that this is nothing to do with Islam. This is a cruel, barbaric, medieval and misogynistic creed. It is not religion, it's a political perversion. And we also need to make these messages very clear to those who in Britain, those young, impressionable individuals who might be considering becoming involved in such an enterprise. Those who are already there need to understand they are not welcome back in this country. The full force of the law will be applied should they come back to this country, and you cannot take a jihad gap year and come back to the United Kingdom with impunity. The second thing that we must do economically is the question of oil has been mentioned, but we also need to stop, through the international financial system, financial flows to ISIS. They are very well funded, and we've got to stop groups in the region playing a double game and publicly decrying them, but providing them with the funding that they require. I give way to my honourable friend.
Right honourable friend, he's making a very important point about the economic levers that need to be deployed. And would he agree with me that there is a a very serious dichotomy that some of the coalition allies in the current arrangement from the Middle East are also some of the funders of the export of some of the undesirable aspects of Islamic fundamentalism, particularly in North and West Africa.
Not only, Mr. Speaker, in agreeing with my honourable friend, are they funders, but they are also ideologically giving succour and support to some of the groups like Isil who have been causing trouble in the region. They cannot have it both ways. When it comes to military action, Mr. Speaker, I absolutely welcome the decision to use British air power. In fact, it's been obvious for some time that the forces on the ground were not able to have a military solution because they didn't have sufficient air power. But in applying British air power, we have to understand this is not just about dealing with the command and control or even supply lines of Isil, but it will require close air support if there's to be a successful counter-offensive by any ground forces in this conflict. And we need to understand the risks that that will pose for our forces. However, I believe it's a mistake today not to include Syria in the motion. Isil operate from Syria. They attack individuals, communities, and the Iraqi state itself from Syria. There is a legal and a clear legal case to attack ISIL bases in Syria, and I'm afraid that sooner or later we're going to have to do it. It would be far better if we'd said so explicitly today. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to take up any more time than required. I'll give this one very briefly.
To the right honourable gentleman in giving way, on the point of Syria, does he agree with me that when ISIS or ISIL is defeated in Syria, it's so important to fill that vacuum with the opposition, Free Syrian Army, rather than allowing the murderous Assad regime to take over? Otherwise, it would be counterproductive.
Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that is a very complex and difficult situation in Syria. My point was simply that if we want to defeat ISIL, we cannot do it without defeating them in Syria from the bases from which they operate there. Otherwise, we are giving ourselves an impossible task which will get us into the mire much later on. No, thank you. Mr. Speaker, what I think we need to be very clear in this country is that we cannot disengage from the global threats that we face. What is very clear to us is that there are those out there who hate us ideologically for who we are, not what we do. When the United States were bombing ISIL and we were delivering humanitarian aid, they did not differentiate between an American hostage and a British hostage being beheaded. Terrorism and terrorist ideology respects no borders. There will undoubtedly be a cost of acting on this occasion, but the cost of not acting would be infinitely greater.
Mr. Dye-Havard.
Little time, and I'll just try and deal with some of the issues. Clearly, we have needs, we have opportunities, and we have tasks to complete. At the moment, as I understand the plan, which is not terribly well being explained in my opinion, is we are just part of a process which is trying to, first of all, find, fix, and then, as the Americans would describe it, finish the opposition. So our contribution to the process at the moment is to help to fix the enemy in the position they're in and not allow them to advance and do any more at the best, and maybe do more than that if we can. In order to do that, that is part of a campaign. The language is overambitious in many regards, always is, about wars on terror and eliminating and destroying and so on. So that needs to be better calibrated, but this is our part, as I understand it, in what is not yet possibly a fully formed strategy, but which is a developing campaign. So we have needs in all of that. We need to do those things and make whatever contribution we can to a long-term process. And as a number of people have said, that involves diplomatic activity as much as it does military activity, and we need to do a lot more with that. And we also need to do a lot more in terms of financial activities and completing and destroying the wrong process of the ideology that they peddle. And my honourable friend from Salford, somewhere or other, made a very important point earlier on, and I'll come back to it later. We need to invest in those processes because we have been disinvesting in those processes. So we have opportunities. We need to understand that others have made progress. It is very interesting to see a woman jet pilot from the UAE flying an F-16 in combat. Other nations are making progress. Do not deny when you're making success to yourself. Now, this doesn't solve everything, but it shows there is a different discussion going on in the region. 3 years ago, I set up a defence and diplomacy group in this Parliament because it was clear then the strategic focus had already moved and we were behind the game. So don't mistake the fact that there is a possibility, an opportunity, no more than that, but you have to develop and work on it. Some sort of rapprochement between Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia might be possible. It's dirty business. Diplomacy always is. And you sometimes have to speak to people you don't want to speak to in order to make progress. Well, I did that for 25 years as a trade union official. I'll tell you, get over it, right? And get on with it is the answer. So you have to make progress and recognise success when you see it. So there are these tasks where we have to invest in the ability to do them. We don't just have to find space by fixing the enemy for the countries on the ground to be able, to be helped, to be enabled to do things for themselves. We have to do things for ourselves because we have dramatically disinvested. We don't have Jones the spy where we need to have Jones the spy because we haven't been paying the money to have intelligence on the ground to understand the position. We have disinvested in our intelligence at home and domestically. So we need to understand it is a long-term process. And in doing all of those things, we need to make long-term investment. But I will just make the... Sorry, go on.
For giving way. Is he in any way perturbed by the open-ended nature of this motion?
It is a reality, Mr. Speaker. I am deterred by it, but I'm also recognising the fact that that is the realpolitik. There is no way you're going to make this change in the short term, and you're not going to make it in a Twitter debate here either, 140 characters. We need to actually reinstate, and I've said this to you, Mr. Speaker, on a number of occasions. We have to have defence debates in this Parliament on a regular basis, a full day of discussion. You need to reinstitute them. This is going to be a long-term process, and this won't be your first discussion about it. You will be discussing it for the next 15 years, and you need to structure in order to do that.
No, my honourable friend knows about these things. Is it in a fact that this whole debate and all the build-up to this debate is actually in reality about the deployment of about 6 Tornado aircraft in North Iraq? If we're genuine about being humanitarian here, wouldn't it be better to deploy about 60 fully laden cargo aircraft to deliver medical supplies, food and water to the affected areas?
Well, the truth is, Mr. Speaker, there is more than 6. You put 6 jets in the air, it takes a lot more than 6 people, I'll tell you that for nothing. And we already are contributing with intelligence, humanitarian support and all the rest of it. But it makes a point. Yes, this is going to be long-term investment and long-term commitment in terms of expenditure on a whole range of places, including perhaps scrubbing out our bases in Syria, in Cyprus and other places. We have to invest to do this stuff. But can I just talk to the law for a moment? I led a report for the Defence Committee earlier on, and in fact, I surprised myself earlier on. 2013 we produced this report, and it was about legal framework for military personnel in future operations. We have domestic difficulties with all of that. The debate about combat immunity has not gone away. And the reason I want to raise this now is there seems to be a settled view in some places that there's a legality to go into Syria. Now, this is your next debate. It's not debate for today, because we're only talking about operating in Iraq, Freudian slip. But if there were an aeroplane to go down in Iraq, the search and rescue mission would not be a problem. Should it go down in Syria, it could well be a problem. So if this hot pursuit argument that is being made, that if you now have Iraq defending itself, and therefore it's legitimate for it to go over the border into Syria in order to do that and be supported by Americans and others, well, do we all of a sudden gain vicariously legal legitimacy because we're part of the support activity for that? Where does this leave individual members of the military in terms of their legal certainty? Is a discussion you will have to have as you get to that. Because I understand the arguments. It's like Kosovo, it's collective defence, it's all of these different things. This needs serious discussion. And the only thing I'd say to people who say, well, we can make all these decisions today, it's already done, it's all very, very, very certain. Well, I don't think it is very, very certain. And I don't think it's very, very certain in our own Supreme Court if you go and ask them. So just be careful about what you do. So that protection for the individuals is equally as important as the protection for the collective approach that we're taking. I will vote for the motion today. I think it's being badly sold. I'll tell you on the other side, you need to get your act together, because I don't think the general public understand that this is one part of a component part of what is a broader developing campaign that will develop into something you might call a strategy. So you need to sell your goods a little bit better, but I think I understand it. But what I also understand is we have a series of tasks. Easy to talk to others about what they should do. I would say to you, you need to address what you need to do.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Mr. Speaker, I shall be very brief. May I first of all say that I applaud the tone and measure of the Prime Minister's speech to the House today. I concur with almost everything my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, said, who has successfully shot all my foxes, and I therefore want only to say this. In my time in this House, Mr. Speaker, the failures in our policy in the Middle East have been, under all governments, really very serious. And I think that the lesson that we have learnt, and the lesson that this government have learnt, needs to be highlighted today, in that the diplomacy that has gone on ahead of the forming of this coalition has been magnificent. It is a new effort in bringing in our coalition partners in this, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Bahrain, and the others, to take part in their fight. It's not the West's fight, it's their fight. And we are in support of their efforts. And I think it should be marked and marked well by the country that we are in support of an Arab coalition. May I endorse the point made by the honourable gentleman in his excellent speech about the need for further and greater intelligence capability on the ground. I'm not party to these decisions. I know not correctly, of course, what we have there already, but whatever it is we have, it's not enough. And we do need, in all these operations, to know much more than we do about the immense intricacy and complication of the tribal structure and the way it works. And the chairman of the Defence Select Committee, in his admirable speech some time ago, made these points very clearly indeed. It is the key to all future operations of this type. I conclude only, Mr. Speaker, by saying that I, together with every other person in this House and in the wider country, wish good luck and safe return to our Tornado pilots, who I can assure the House will give a magnificent effort on our behalf.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
The threat that is posed by the barbarism, brutality and savagery by ISIL is not merely a threat to the Sunni, Shia, Kurds, Christians and Yazidi of Iraq itself. ISIL poses a clear and present threat to the people of the United Kingdom. It is a clear and present threat to the territorial integrity of Iraq, the government of which has asked us to intervene by way of airstrikes, and it is a clear and present threat to regional stability, international security and civilization in general. And for those reasons, we are in a different place than we were a year ago when this House was last asked to consider military action, that time in Syria. And for those reasons, we on these benches in the Democratic Unionist Party, unlike last time, will be supporting military action. A plea has gone out to the country. The sovereign nation of Iraq faces a perilous time. It has submitted a request for assistance at this crucial juncture to assist it in protecting its national integrity and the security and safety of its people. How, with our history of fighting for freedom and democracy, for justice and human rights, can we as a nation turn our backs and reject such a plea? There is no question mark this time over the legality and validity of intervention in these circumstances, and there is certainly no question mark over the need for immediate intervention. The savagery, the sheer brutality, the scale of the genocidal wave of terror sweeping the region is truly terrifying. It is a savagery and obscenity which continues to shock even the most hardened commentators and those with great experience of previous conflicts. In Northern Ireland, we are well used and have seen it first-hand and directly, the impact of terrorism on families and communities. But this is on a different scale, a medieval type of barbarism that people in the country want a response to.
Can I give way? I will. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way just. My right honourable friend agree with me
that any decision to take military action is not one that will be taken lightly by any member or right honourable member of this House, bearing in mind the sacrifice or the dangers that's facing our servicemen and women. However, we cannot sit idly by and allow the group of Islamic fanatics to terrorise and butcher innocent people in Iraq.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and clearly, yes, the dangers are great to our servicemen and women, who I want to pay tribute to and salute for their efforts in many conflicts. And again, they're being asked to do a job on behalf of the people of this country, and the House is coming together to ask them to do that job, and we wish them well, and we know that they will display the courage and gallantry and effectiveness that they always do in these situations.
Would the honourable member allow me?
I will give way, yes.
Does the honourable member accept that had the House voted last year to go into Syria or to bomb Syria, that in effect we would have been on the same side as ISIS and fighting their same battle? And does that not lead us all to have a great deal of caution that within 1 year circumstances can change very rapidly and an incredibly volatile civil war that's going on in that region?
Well, I'm grateful for the intervention, and he's right to say that the situation may have led to the consequences that he outlines, and that is why we in these benches voted against the intervention in Syria at that time. And we will take our decisions, whether in any future situation that arises, whether a motion comes before this House in future on Syria or on the intervention of combat troops or whatever it is, we will take those decisions at the time on their merits. We're taking this decision today on the merits of the circumstances that are before us today in this House, and we believe it is absolutely right and imperative indeed that we give the assistance that the Iraqi government has asked for. It's totally legal, it's on a sound legal basis, and it will be according to a well thought out plan and will make an effective difference. And that is the difference between now and last time. No, I can't give way because I've used up all the interventions. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that despite what we've said about the barbarism and savagery of ISIL, and it is well documented and people can see it for themselves on their TV screens and read about it, there are people who will say, well, why should the UK get involved? Why should we directly intervene in a situation like this for the reasons that have been outlined by many already? The fact of the matter is that ISIL's threat, its brutality and savagery is aimed not just at the peoples of Iraq, but they present a clear threat to this country and the West and the region in general. And unless confronted now, we will be storing up much greater trouble for this country and for our citizens in the future. We have seen the brutal murder of David Haines, the kidnapping and the threat against Alan Henning, and others who have been brutally terrorised and murdered. It is not just the fact that it presents a threat to the UK. This organisation has already taken direct action against the citizens of the United Kingdom, and that demands a response on the part of this country. We simply cannot allow the creation and consolidation of a state covering large swathes of terrorist territory, which would be the base for the planning and direction of terrorism against this country and on a worldwide scale. Hundreds of people have already gone to the region, as we know from this country, and have engaged in terrorist activity and in war. We need to be very clear that as we engage on this action in this House today, that we also say to the people of the United Kingdom that we're going to take that decisive and clear action that is needed to prevent people from this country who have gone to the Middle East, to Iraq and Syria, from returning back and becoming a major direct threat to the citizens of this United Kingdom. It would be simply wrong to take this action today and simply then to say we're not going to be able, for whatever reason, to take action to prevent these people coming back to the United Kingdom. That has to go hand in hand. If Parliament were to reject this request today, Mr. Speaker, it would send the disastrous signal that the United Kingdom does not stand by its friends, by its allies, in times of trouble, that it is prepared to ignore the barbarism of ISIL, that it is prepared to ignore its international responsibilities and obligations. Intervention is justified because it is on a sound legal basis. It's at the request of the Iraqi government. There's a clear and direct threat to the United Kingdom through the murders of British citizens already. We will be part of a coalition which includes Sunni Muslim states. There is a clear plan, and we can make an effective difference for the better. The barbarism of Isil has already targeted UK citizens, and we must respond to that, otherwise we will be failing our people. We wish our airmen and women well, and we wish them Godspeed.
Okay, James.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the motion before us today, but I am not under any illusions about the risks and difficulties involved. We have heard already many references to those risks today. And from those who are more cautious about any action at all, a sense that what is covered by the motion before us today will not be enough to eliminate the threat to the region and the wider world posed by the ISIS barbarians. But when the people of a peace-loving nation come with heavy hearts to the conclusion that there is no alternative to the waging of a just war, the situation will always be fraught with doubt and uncertainty, a lack of trustworthy intelligence about what is happening on the ground, concerns about those close to the conflict with whom it will be necessary to form alliances, a desire to ensure a more promising political landscape than currently exists or, frankly, is likely to exist this side of 50 years. Those against any form of action will always pose questions that are impossible to answer at the outset of any conflict. They will draw on historical examples of when things go wrong, of which there are several in recent years. But they will ignore the examples of more successful interventions, such as in Bosnia and in Syria Leone. The fact that the answers to those questions are imperfect does not provide sufficient justification for turning our backs on the Iraqi government's plea for help. Yes, we must proceed with caution. There must be an absolute commitment to minimise casualties among innocent people who have suffered so much. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
And I thank the honourable lady for giving way and was listening very carefully to what she had to say and the rest of the debate, and I will support the motion, but I think she's absolutely right to make the point about minimising casualties. It is one of those arguments that are put against action that we must hear, but it shouldn't prevent us from making the right decision today. But of course, the concern that ISIS is embedded amongst civilians is something that we have to take very, very seriously as we go forward with airstrikes.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and he is quite right that the threat to civilian life is so much greater from inaction, in my opinion, than it is from action. I will give way one more time.
I agree with the Honourable Lady in the remark that she's just made in what's been a very thoughtful speech. But I hope, like me, she will be hoping to hear from the government during the course of this debate how it intends to work closely with the Iraqi government as a partner here to ensure that there is humanitarian assistance available for the civilians that get caught up in this conflict.
I very much agree with my honourable friend. That absolutely is a priority, and that should not be instead of what this country provides through its humanitarian aid, but as well as. I want also to make the point that, of course, military action is not the only thing that this House must concern itself with. And I strongly agree with many of the points raised by the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Salford and Eccles, that we really must get behind the moderate and the universal force of those of Muslim faith, both here and abroad, in seeking to educate the younger, more hot-headed members of that faith, who are such a minority that this path is not the path that is true Islam and is not the path that they should follow. But proceed to these airstrikes we must. Of that I am in no doubt, and for many reasons. First, the unique nature of the threat. We are dealing with a growing army of medieval barbarians who have the most modern 21st century military equipment at their disposal. The methods of ISIS are so barbaric, the manpower, military and financial resources they have so substantial, that the other regional powers are not a match for them without Western support. Initially, their focus has been on securing territorial gains and then expanding within the Middle East. Unchecked, the history of fundamentalism shows us that there is no doubt whatsoever that ISIS will then turn their sights on Western targets. The Prime Minister is quite right when he says that ISIS are a direct threat to us in the UK. And that is clear from the number of young men who have already travelled and been recruited by them to join their fight, some of whom will find ways of getting back into this country, no matter what measures we put in place to deter them, to try to mount terrorist attacks. But that is not the only justification. It is only 11 years since we invaded Iraq, an invasion to which we were not invited, for which there was no post-invasion plan, and which presided over the disastrous de-Baathification of the Iraqi army. There then followed Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo Bay, and other gross abuses and insults to the Islamic world. It was Lord Salisbury who said, "Our first duty is towards the people of this country to maintain their interests and rights. Our second is to all humanity." I fear I can't for the time, I'm sorry. Mr. Speaker, nowhere is this second point that Lord Salisbury made more true than in the Middle East, a part of the world which this country and France were actually governing up until just 70 years ago. In supporting this motion, I believe that we should fulfil our moral responsibility to the region by confronting ISIS and supporting the forces of moderation in that part of the world. We should increase our aid to the region and take in our fair share of refugees. They cannot all continue to be absorbed by Jordan, Turkey and Lebanon, on top of the hundreds of thousands, if not approaching 1 million people that those countries are having or already have had to absorb. And we should prevent further spread of militant ideology, especially among young Muslims in Britain. ISIS are a grave threat to world peace, and in their barbarism, a truly satanic force which must be confronted by the rest of humanity. We have the measure of fundamentalist Islam, even if we are still working out exactly and in fine detail how to respond. As Austen Chamberlain said of Hitler's Germany, "For a people who believe in nothing but force, force is the only answer." I'm afraid that this will turn out to be true of the war declared by ISIS on all those who do not share their narrow and warped interpretation of Islam, and on all women and girls of whatever faith or none. Although military solutions are far from enough, it is very unlikely that we will be able to maintain our freedoms without utilising our military strength as part of a much broader strategy.
Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The immediate decision before us in this debate is about military action. But behind this is about values. It is not a war against Islam. Islam is one of the great world religions, practiced freely without any harm to anyone by millions of people in this country and around the world. So it isn't about Islam, but it is about coexistence. Coexistence is absolutely fundamental to our society. The ability to elect governments freely chosen by the people, equality of rights between men and women, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. This is fundamental. ISIS rejects every tenet of this. That is why it kills with impunity fellow Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, engages in sexual exploitation and trade of women, and cares nothing for anyone that does not sign up to its single truth. It is not about Islam, but it is about coexistence. Now, the shadow of past decisions is a long one on debates like this, and in particular, the 2003 decision to invade Iraq. And that is because there is a live debate about the degree to which we are either responsible for creating or fomenting violent jihadism. I think it's really important to be clear about this. I would accept that past decisions have angered jihadists and maybe encouraged some to join them. But it is a fundamental mistake to think that we are responsible for violent jihadism. Let us not forget the invasion of September, the bombing of the World Trade Center on September the 11th took place 2 years before the invasion of Iraq. Syria, until recent days, has been a byword for non-intervention by the West, yet it is now the headquarters of global jihad.
I'm very grateful. Isn't it also the fact that the plot against the World Trade Center was in the 90s, the bombing of the USS Cole was in 98, and that Al-Qaeda was carrying out plots and activities of a similar kind to this well before the intervention in Iraq?
My honourable friend makes a good point, and it's also worth stressing that the policy of the United States administration for the past 5 or 6 years has been absolutely to resist intervention, yet we still have violent Islamic jihadism and we still have ISIS. I will give you.
I just want to query something on the history from the honourable gentleman. What is the connection between the twin terrorist attack and Iraq?
Zero. Violent Islamic jihadism has been around long before the decision in 2003. And beneath the argument that it is really our fault lies a new imperialism, an imperialist conceit that in foreign policy terms seeks to divide the world into adults and children, where the United States and the United Kingdom and other countries are defined as adults, and movements elsewhere, including the jihadists, are defined almost as children who only react in response to what we do or we do not do. This is not the case. They are responsible for their own actions and their own ideology. No one forces anyone to behead innocent journalists and aid workers on the internet. No one forces anyone to go from this country to join a group that carries out those acts. No one has forced anyone to carry out the terrorist acts that we have seen on our own streets. We cannot say this loudly and clearly enough. Those who carry out these actions and foment this ideology are adults who are responsible for their own actions. Now, this brings me to the motion before us today. It sets out a plan for military action in Iraq, and I will vote for it tonight. But I have to ask, as others have asked, why is it right to carry out such actions against ISIS in Iraq, but not in Syria? The government has welcomed the action carried out by the United States and other Arab countries in Syria in recent days. If it is to be welcomed and right by others, why is it not welcome and right for us? And if the government's position is that it is illegal or wrong to act in this way in Syria, then why is it not illegal or wrong for the United States and those countries taking part in this action? Militarily, we have to ask ourselves, what is the point of chasing ISIS from Iraq through a barely existing border to Syria? And morally, we have to ask, why is it right to come to the aid of the victims of ISIS who are living under a democracy in Iraq, but not those who are living under a dictatorship in Syria? Isn't it the case that the motion before us is actually a reflection of where the country stands right now? Somewhat limited in its confidence, overburdened by past events, looking too much in the rear-view mirror. I would say out-damned spot is no basis for taking crucial foreign policy decisions. We should instead learn from the past, ally our soft power with hard power, follow through on our decisions to intervene so that we achieve our objectives, and not just define the struggle as a generational one and begin military action, but actually will the means to complete the job.
Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
I support this motion today, ever conscious, as we all should be, of the young men and women who will be placing in harm's way on our account. But I do support it. Indeed, The motion, for me, does not go as far as it should do. I think it is a snapshot of what will be required. The permission which this motion gives for the deployment of the tornadoes from RAF Akrotiri, and the fact that we are telegraphing safe havens over the Syrian border to ISIL. These are matters of concern. So I think it is a snapshot of the issues we need to address, but it does not, for me, go anything like far enough, and I'm quite certain that we will have to return in this House to some of the issues we have been discussing today. In particular, the point that has been made, I think, more firmly from the other side of the House than from this side, about the need for us to engage over Syria and on Syria. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think there are many other things that are required, but there are 4 points I wanted to make in the brief time allowed to me in support of, but in addition to, the motion that we have seen and are supporting today. The first is that there is no doubt that this requires a multilateral effort, that it needs to ensure that the United Nations is engaged in every possible way it can be. Of course, as others have said, the United Nations is not going to agree at this point to the motion that we would want to see on Syria, but nevertheless we must engage with the United Nations, not least its humanitarian agencies. The vast power and legitimacy and authority that the support of the UN conveys and gives us cannot be understated. And we need to ensure that there is massive regional support. The Prime Minister deserves credit for having tried to secure the widest possible coalition. It's been a good start. I was very pleased to see the successful meeting with Iran in New York. The government deserved credit for that, along with many others in this House. I have concluded that the relationship with Iran needs to be rebased, and much more work needs to be done to try and bring Iran into the Committee of Nations. And let us not in this House be too pious either about British policy to Iran. It was a British coup d'etat in 1953 that removed the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mossadegh, and let us bear that in mind as well as we consider the policy. The second... Yes, of course.
But just to illustrate some of the complications of the situation here, if indeed we do bring Iran back in, is it not the case that Iran will make absolutely certain that our other professed wish to bring down President Assad never happens? So these are very, very complex relationships.
Right, they are very complex, but that argument must not be an argument against trying. We're not trying to do this on any terms, but we must do everything we can to achieve that. Yes, I will. Yeah.
There was a distinguished Secretary on International Development in the previous incarnation. Will he tell us what his view is on winning the peace as well as winning the war, which clearly was not done with Mr. Paul Brenner being put in to run the Iraq regime after the first Iraq conflict? What are the lessons of that from his previous experience, and how will we engage people so that they can have a settled political settlement once all the fighting and death is over?
Well, the honourable gentleman preempts the point I'm just coming on to. The second point I wish to make is that Britain's involvement must be in training and arming and giving strategic support and planning. Many people have already suggested that the links with the Free Syrian Army need to be enhanced, and with the Kurds and with the Iraqi army as well. But this is an area where the British military excel. We need to ensure that we do everything we can to help train and arm and provide the strategic support and planning. Those are issues at which Britain is undoubtedly one of the best in the world. The third point I wish to make is that the humanitarian protection of civilians is absolutely essential in this. I remember over the Libyan campaign, when I had the honour of sitting on the National Security Council, the personal attention the then Defence Secretary took to ensuring that the targeting was of such a quality and standard that civilian casualties were absolutely minimised. There will be nothing worse than the damage that will be caused by an air campaign if huge numbers of innocent civilians are attacked, as they have been in other campaigns, but as they were not in Libya. Libya was very successful in that respect at least. And we must ensure that the precise targeting, the protection of civilians, the absolute priority we give to protecting those who are at grave risk in this conflict is right at the top of the list. Now, the fourth point, which brings me directly to the point that the honourable gentleman from Nottingham made, is there anyone who thinks this crisis is going to be solved by smart weapons from 12,000 feet is completely, totally wrong. And I think that's pretty widely accepted, at least in the House. And it is absolutely critical that there is a plan for when this crisis is over, and that the plan is enunciated now, because we need to ensure that we split off the hardliners, those who are intent on military action and advancing their cause by weaponry and ordnance, from those who are biddable and who may be brought back into a more sensible dialogue and international comity here. Now, we need to ensure that people know that there is a plan, that there is a plan which will provide a better life for their children and their grandchildren when this is all over. And that means focusing on governance, as has already been said. The brilliant quote by Ban Ki-moon absolutely sums it up. Focusing on governance, on local governance and accountability, on providing some sort of basic services, on tackling the extremes of destitution and poverty which fuel these conflicts, on focusing on bad governance and unfairness, and showing people that there is a better life when this conflict is over, and that we are part of the grouping that is insistent on making sure they have that better life. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is not just something we see in Iraq and indeed in Syria, all across this part of the world, from North Nigeria, from Mali, Somalia, Libya, as well as Iraq and Syria. The effect of bad governance, alienation from those who govern, deep systemic poverty with no hope, no opportunity, no economic activity, conflict absolutely endemic in the lives of everyone, every day, especially women and children who are the most vulnerable in these circumstances. These are the things that I make in my fourth and final point, that we as a community, the international community, need to make clear that we will address when this conflict is over. It's not just about smart weaponry, it's about smart policies, soft power as well as hard power, which is absolutely essential to the solution.
Mr. George Galloway.
Speaker, time doesn't permit me to tell you how many millions of I told you so's are currently being spoken in the country, or will be when they read of this debate. Ordinary people, millions of them, who knew what the expensive talent governing our country did not know, namely that there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, there was no Islamist fundamentalism in Iraq before Mr. Blair and his mouthpieces that are still here and Mr. Bush invaded and occupied them. What a tangled web we have woven is abundantly clear to everyone watching this debate. The mission creep hasn't even waited for the end of the debate. The words on the motion are about bombing Iraq. If there's a consensus in here that we're going to soon be bombing Syria, the words don't mention boots on the ground, but there's a consensus here that there will be boots on the ground. The only question being, whose boots are they? This debate has been characterized by members of parliament moving around imaginary armies. The Free Syrian Army is a fiction which has been in the receipt of hundreds of millions of dollars, huge hundreds of tons of weapons, virtually all of which were taken from them by Al-Qaeda, which is now mutated into Isil. The Iraqi army is the most expensively trained and most modernly equipped army in history. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been expended on the Iraqi army, which ran away, leaving its equipment behind it. Isil itself is an imaginary army. A former defense secretary, no less, said we must bomb their bases. They don't have any bases. The territory they control is the size of Britain. and yet there's only between 10 and 20,000 of them. Do the maths. They don't concentrate as an army. They don't live in bases. And the only way a force of that size could successfully hold the territory that they hold is if they have a population which is acting as the water in which they are swimming. And that population is quiescent because of Western policies and Western invasion and occupation. That's the truth of the matter. Isil could not survive for 5 minutes if the tribes in the west of Iraq rose up against them. Yes, I will. Happily.
And how appalled people will be to hear him say that women buried alive, women enslaved, are quiescent in their persecution by these people. What a total disgrace.
Yeah. Well, they don't like it up them, Mr. Speaker. They'd rather have an imaginary debate moving around imaginary armies. Isil is a death cult. It's a gang of terrorist murderers. It's not an army, and it's certainly not an army that's going to be destroyed by aerial bombardment. Isil is able to rule the parts of Iraq that it does because nobody in those parts has any confidence in the government in Baghdad. A sectarian government helped into power by Bremer and the deliberate sectarianization of Iraqi politics by the occupation authorities. The government knows that. That's why they pushed al-Maliki out, even though he won the election, by the way, if we're talking about democracy. They pushed him out because they knew that far too many people in ISIL-occupied Iraq had no confidence in the government in Baghdad. Nobody has any confidence in the army emanating out of Baghdad. So this will not be solved by bombing. Mr. Speaker, we've been bombing Iraqis for 100 years. 100 years. We dropped the world's first chemical bombs on them in the 1920s. We attacked them and helped to kill their king in the 1930s. We helped the murder of their president in 1963, helping the Ba'ath Party into power. We bombed them again through the 90s. Yes.
Sure, we're all ever so grateful for the lecturer, but what is his solution to this problem?
Well, now I've got an extra minute, thanks to you, I'll be able to tell you. This will not be solved. Every matter will be made worse. Extremism will spread further and deeper around the world, just like happened as a result of the last Iraq war. The people outside can see it, but the fools in here who draw a big salary and big expenses cannot or will not see it, like the Honourable Lady with her asinine intervention. I'll give them.
Thank the Honourable Member very much for giving way, but would the Honourable Member please bring us towards his solution to this problem?
Although with 5 minutes, it's difficult. We have to strengthen those who are already fighting ISIL. We have to give them all the weapons they need. The Baghdad government has paid for weapons which have still not even been delivered. We have to strengthen the Kurdish fighters, who are doing a good job, by the way, in fighting ISIL. We have imaginary armies, the Saudi, Emirati, Qatari, they're all imaginary armies. They haven't even told their own people that they're on the masthead. Has anyone here seen a picture of them fighting in Syria? Anyone seen a picture of a Saudi jet bombing in Syria? Saudi Arabia is the nest from which ISIL and these other vipers have come. And by the way, they do a fine line in head chopping themselves. Saudi Arabia has 700 warplanes. Get them to bomb. Turkey is a NATO member. Get Turkey to bomb. The last people who should be returning to the scene of their former crimes are Britain, France, and the United States of America.
Mr. Adam Holloway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think when people in this House think of ISIS, they think of a foreign fighter dressed in black, holding before him a terrified offering dressed in orange, a kind of spectre or ghost screaming at us out of cyberspace. Well, last week I was in Iraq with the member for Spelthorne, and an Iraqi said to me, "You've got to see ISIS in Iraq like this. It's the good, the bad and the ugly. The good are the Sunni tribesmen rising up against the sectarian government in Baghdad. The bad are the foreign jihadis, and the ugly, the former Ba'athist regime people that my regiment fought in the First Gulf War." Now, who's going to kick the bad out? Who's going to kick the jihadis out? The only people on the ground who will be able to do that are the good and the ugly, the tribes and the Baathists. Time and time again, we see that the only way that you're going to remove these people is without the consent of the local people. This is overwhelmingly a political problem, even if it's a security headache. It's not a first-order clash between the West and the Muslim world, but between neighbours. In Iraq, it's a sectarian conflict. I mean, ISIS didn't take over Iraq's second biggest city by magic or force of arms. No, they took it over because the local people allowed them to. One of my friends from the war in 2003 put it like this. He said, for people in Mosul, there's very little difference between living under a sectarian Shia government and ISIS. And then he said, the only difference actually is that ISIS won't let you smoke. Okay, that might be overdoing it somewhat, but we've only had the most limited reports of Sunni resistance from inside that great swathe of territory they control. Look, none of this excuses the extraordinary cruelty of ISIS, but even before we even think about anything beyond emergency airstrikes in Iraq and escalation into Syria, ought we not to stop and work out what needs to be done politically? How we might take the political ground back from Isil. At Sandhurst, they taught us that you exercise military force in order to support political ends, that politics should dictate the terms of military engagement. John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, as we've heard, he's worked hard to put together a coalition. But if you were trying to make it up, the worst way to start this campaign, it would be headlines around the world, including in the Muslim world, saying US-led airstrikes. I'd love to.
Anyway, what it seems to be the honourable member seems to be getting is we have been invited, we've been requested by a democratically elected government to to help to deal with a mess that many people, including myself, believe we created. So what do we now do when they ask for that help? Do we say we created that mess, but we actually are having nothing else to do with it? It's none of our business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think a first step for him might be to join the territorial army and in a year's time volunteer to serve in the region. Look, it should be Arab countries at the forefront of this fight, and we should be thinking how to help Iraqi and Syrian Sunnis to gain security and a fairer deal so that they eject ISIS themselves. Not yet diving in completely, the Western capitals have learnt something from the absolute disasters of Iraq and Afghanistan, the NATO deployment, our chaotic and inconsistent response to the Arab Spring. But what are we doing with the US Secretary of State seeming to chair this effort? Yeah, okay.
I share his feeling that bombing can only work if there's a plan for what next. But I'm not hearing from him what that should be. And I think I'm probably not alone in this chamber of people who aren't certain how they're going to vote on this matter because they're not hearing enough about what happens next. And I'd like him to tell us what he thinks should.
Thank you, and I think that's an extremely fair observation. There is no simple solution to any of this, but the answer does not come from something military that is led by the West. It comes from something political that is led by people within the region. Look, there's a huge amount that we can do, but mostly that should involve encouraging and enabling other people. This shouldn't be a rerun of Iraq in 1991, where, yes, there was a big grand coalition of Arab states, but it was still led by the United States. And it shouldn't be 2003 either. The lead for this, if we're going to win, should come from within the region. It should include a long-term political vision. Otherwise, step by small step, we're going to enter a much darker age of war and radicalisation.
Well, my honourable friend,
no. If the West fails to morph into the background, away from the military lead, then I'm afraid our vote today will be driving our nation towards disaster.
Yeah. Anne Clwyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not the first time that I've disagreed with a member for Bradford West. In fact, I can remember the last Speaker of the House of Commons asking the member for Bradford West, it wasn't the member for Bradford West then, to leave the chamber because he misbehaved. The microphones, I believe, are quite good here, Mr. Speaker. You don't need to shout to make yourself heard here if people are listening. But I'll say to the member for Bradford West, you are wrong, as you were then, you're wrong now. There was Al-Qaeda in Iraq before 2003. It was under the name of Ansar al-Islam. And it was the Kurds, in fact, who told me about Ansar al-Islam at that particular time, and they showed me the people, the heads of the people who had been beheaded by the very same group. So it is not true that they were not there before 2003. And can I remind the House also that the member for Bradford West was the man who greeted Saddam Hussein as a great friend, as a great leader of his people, and shook his hand in Iraq. Now, I don't think the Kurds would have been very pleased at that, and I don't think the Shia would have been very pleased with that, because we know exactly what Saddam Hussein did to those hundreds of thousands of Shia and Kurds who were exterminated by him. And I would suggest that anybody who doubts doubts that point should go to the mass graves which are in Al-Hilla and in fact all over Iraq. So I fully support this resolution. I don't think it goes far enough. I've listened with interest to what the Americans have been saying in the last few days when the General Martin Dempsey, US chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other senior military figures in the US have said that air power alone cannot defeat ISIS. Now look at Mosul, which is a case in point. Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. Yes, the Iraqi military fled. I believe there's an alternative story to that as well, that they did not flee, except that they were ordered to flee by the people who were then in control of the military in Iraq. And the Mosul...
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Last week I met with 120 Mancunian Iraqi Christian diaspora from Mosul, whose families live in tents in exile in foreign lands. They just want their families to go back and build civil society and live in peace. It's in our self-interest to help them do that. Does you not agree?
Yes, I absolutely agree, because the fact that the airstrikes obviously have not been able to recapture Mosul. Mosul is still in the hands of ISIS. 4 months on, is still in the hands of ISIS. 2 million people live in Mosul. Many of them, as my honourable friend has said, have fled from that city. And that comes to another problem, of course, is the number of refugees who've gone across borders. They've gone into Iraqi Kurdistan, they've gone to Turkey.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. The question that sits in the air from both the previous speakers before herself is who is going to defeat ISIS. My honourable friend was suggesting it had to be done internally. It had to be the Sunnis in Iraq and Syria overturning them themselves. Otherwise, there's a question of a regional ownership of the military force to drive them out. Who is going to provide that effective force? Otherwise, are we going to be bombing for 10 years with little to show for it?
Of course, is a problem, and nobody would dispute that. And certainly the Iraqi army apparently are not ready to do this, are not properly trained to do this, and you can't depend on the Peshmerga. Peshmerga is a small group of soldiers who've been defending their own homeland. They can't possibly be responsible for defending the whole of Iraq. That is just pie in the sky. So I think this is a question that will continue to challenge us. What exactly are we going to do if the airstrikes are not successful? The other point which was raised, of course, is about the refugees. Some countries, for example, have been very much more ready to take refugees than apparently this country. More than 3 million people have fled Syria over the last 3 years. They're being sheltered by a small number of neighbouring countries. In the last week, more than 100,000 additional refugees are said to have crossed Turkey's border, fearing the advance of ISIS. Now, while we have made some kind of offer to the refugees, only 75, I understand, individuals have arrived in the UK since January of this year. In comparison, Germany has pledged to resettle 20,000. Though resettling several hundred over 3 years doesn't respond adequately to the clear need. But I think also we are going to have to look to Syria and see what we are going to do in that country. And I'm sure there'll be another debate in the House of Commons on that particular issue. But the Kurds actually, before in 2003, invited us to help them. It isn't true that nobody asked us to go into Iraq. The Kurds asked us in 2003. I remember saying so in this chamber just a few weeks after I came back from Kurdistan. So again, that's another myth that I would want to dispel. But I think the new Iraqi government deserves our full support. Maliki, of course, alienated so many of the Sunnis. The very Sunnis that we hope will fight to defend Iraq have been alienated and have to be won back. The Kurds we can depend on, but there are disputes between the Kurds and the Iraqi central government which will have to be resolved in some way. But I fully support this resolution. It's a good step in the right direction.
Mr. Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we get through the debate, we start to say a number of similar things, but before I say the three things I wanted to say, two things I think are pertinent. Firstly, most of us approach this with a sense of humility, bearing in mind the history of this place and what has happened. And secondly, as recent speeches have indicated, there are layers of complexity in this area, and we approach simplistic answers with even greater trepidation. I wanted to make three brief points. Firstly, in support of the motion, the particular nature of this so-called Isil has become clear in recent months. And we have to be careful about the naming here. The Islamic world is deeply upset at the identification of this terrorist criminal group with the words Islamic State. They're neither Islamic nor a state. They've started to be called now in some parts of the region Daesh, which is a derogatory term, but we must be very sensitive to this. It's not Islamic and they're not a state. But the particular nature of the group has become clear. Their wickedness is demonstrated in the fact that they want to occupy not just territory, but minds. They want to seize not just land, but people. And the barbarity of the executions is matched by the barbarity of the way in which they seduce and corrupt the people they bring from different parts of the world to follow their lies. So we know now the nature of this group, which is why this motion is set as it is. And I think in support of the government's motion, had we been discussing something different today, I think the tone of the debate would have been rather different. And although I absolutely agree with others, we are going to revisit this. Having the motion as it is and allowing us to proceed step by step might be wise. This is a long struggle. To an extent, I'm reassured by the fact that there is a coalition now of 60 dealing with it. But I would remind the House that for the last 3 years there have been a coalition of over 100 countries, 100 states and different entities called the Friends of Syria. And that has achieved none of its objectives, and Syria has been rather dropped off the map in recent times until now. Yes, of course.
I thank the honourable friend very much for giving way, and I would like to thank him personally for all the work that he did in the region while he was minister. But I think today it's very difficult what we have to do, but what we have to do is target these people, that Isil, who are bringing back the Middle East to the Dark Ages, and there is no two ways about it, and the brutality of them, as he's been saying, is second to none. And the idea that we do nothing, it would be absolutely wrong. So I entirely support the motion today.
I entirely agree with my honourable friend. Absolutely. The barbarity is what has brought us to today, and a recognition that beyond the need to deal with force, there is something else that is needed longer term. And that brings me to my second point. Could I just make just a moment? That brings me to my second point. Having travelled in the last few weeks to both Tunisia and the UAE, none of us in this place should underestimate the importance of those Islamic states having joined against this terrorist criminal group. This is a big thing. As the honourable gentleman from Bradford West indicated, none of this is simple. And the fact that some in the past have supported what became this terrorist group because they felt they were standing up for Sunni oppression, against Sunni oppression, is a very big thing. And that now states and theological leaders are denouncing it is a profound shift in opinion, and to be able to attack those who are attacking your enemies is a big thing. And that shift has been of profound importance, and none of us here should minimise it. It is complex, the relationships there. Not all Islamist groups are enemy groups. That is why some of the leaders in some of the states go easy on some groups, but starting now to make a clear distinction, recognising that groups that label themselves in a particular way, profess to stand up for those Sunnis being oppressed, are not always what they seem. This is a profound change and enables this alliance not to be led by the West, as my honourable friend indicated, but be led by the thought leaders of the Middle East. And it marks a turning point in the way this should be handled in the future.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is making a typically thoughtful speech. It would be unthinkable to stand back and repeat the mistakes of history, the slaughter of Srebrenica and Rwanda by barbarism. But it would be unthinkable also, and the Right Honourable Gentleman is right, to fail to learn the lessons of history. Evil thrives on a sense of grievance. Does he agree with me, therefore, that on the one hand, it's of the highest importance that we work with and support progressive elements in the Muslim community, nationally and internationally, and resist the demonisation of the Muslim community, and that on the other hand, a regional political settlement must include a two-state solution?
Mr. Alistair Burt.
I'll leave the latter part of the honourable gentleman's remarks, because there is an issue about settling wider grievances, and that's part of the layers of complexity. But his first point is absolutely right, and the unequivocal response of the Islamic community in the United Kingdom to what we have seen in recent months has again been one of the most profound developments, and is absolutely correct. No demonisation of the Muslim community in the United Kingdom, because their response has been very dramatic and very strong, and that must be used to bring to the young people who've been corrupted by this false ideology a sense that their Muslim faith should take them in a different direction. The last point I want to make concerns Syria. I entirely agree with colleagues that have raised Syria as the issue which might have been discussed today. We know it's there. because there are no borders between Iraq and Syria, and there are no borders in dealing with this issue. It will be dealt with in Syria sooner or later. But there's some misunderstandings about how Syria has arisen and the relationship between President Assad and the extremists. President Assad's fight is with his people who rose up against him and who are represented by those who supported the protesters, have been recognised by over 100 states in the Syrian National Coalition and the Free Syrian Army. The enemies of those people are not just Assad, but also the terrorist criminal forces who have come into it. Assad has been in league with those forces because Assad's greatest fear is his people, not the extremists. What would have happened last year had we taken action against Assad would have been to demonstrate that the rest of the world was prepared to stand up against him and provide the opportunity, as he realised that, to bring him to negotiations. He will not negotiate for the peace of Syria until he is forced to do so. And that is why we should be looking to support those who have been fighting the terrorists and criminals on the ground. That is the Peshmerga, it is the Iraqi army, but the vulnerabilities of the Iraqi army are well known and they can't be relied upon for some time to come, but also the Free Syrian Army, who do exist. They are not a fiction. They are fighting in Aleppo. They have fought both Assad and the terrorists for the past year in Aleppo, and they should be supported. If now we know we cannot do the groundwork, because we can't, it has to be taken on by people in the region. Support the people who are doing it. Look what the United States has done now to move covert to overt support, and we should be trying to provide the same thing. Lastly, in order to see the overall settlement, underlying grievances do need to be tackled, but there is one thing that is the key, and that is to see an end to the intolerance in the region, which has been characterised by religious intolerance, but sect against sect, those against the Christian community and the like. Intolerance runs through the region like a stick of rock, and its damage now is seen in the intolerance of the terrorist and the criminal.
Good.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to follow the member for North East Bedfordshire, and it just reminded me that I think the Foreign Office is a worse place for him not being. I want to pick up a few strands which have been developing. One was the member for Gravesham talked about how the bad and the good are trying to get rid of the ugly. But he left unanswered the question, what do we do if they ask for the help of the outside to get rid of the ugly? And he didn't answer what we do in that position. So whether we like it that this is seen as US-led or not, a democratically elected state is asking for our help, and I think we are duty-bound to give that help.
Well, just on that point, before you moves on, I always listen with rapt attention to her views on international affairs. But as someone who sat here, listened to all the speeches, could she guide me on how we get out of this once we're in? What is the long-term game?
Very fair point, which I shall try to address, because it takes me to something the Prime Minister and our front bench have said in opening speeches. First of all, I'm really glad that this time we're having a clear outlined strategy, which we didn't have a year ago, and I think that's why I feel comfortable to vote for the debate. But he also reminded of something of what Ban Ki-moon said, that whilst missiles kill terrorists, it's good governance which kills terrorism. And the long-term answer will be the good governance of functioning nation-states. And therefore, we have to ensure that those nation-states which are currently functioning in the region, which are your Jordans, your Turkey and your Iran, do not fall apart or don't get compromised. And those who are at the risk of fragmenting, which is Iraq, which to some extent could be Jordan if we are not careful, actually that this isn't allowed to happen because it's not in our interest. And it would seem to be that the fact that Frederick the Great said he can't ride on horseback against ideas. So this isn't a newly discovered wisdom that you don't fight ideas as such with arms. It's just something which you seem to be forgetting in regular intervals, and every generation seems to be needed to be reminded of this again. But why does it require military action now? I think it does it now as a starting point, because there's a myth developing that ISIS is undefeatable, that it will simply spread, that it cannot be contained. And the first step has been to show that it can be contained. So those who want to fight it, that they will get support. Certainly.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and the very point that she's making is very, very valid at this moment in time. Already the air attacks by the United States government and other forces have shown some dividends in that ISIS have slowed down their advance. Surely if we join the campaign at this moment in time, we will help that to happen. We will enable with the armies on the ground and then bring the Christians and the ethnic groups back into the areas where they want to stay and want to live.
Yes, indeed, and the armies on the ground will not be our armies. That's also very important, because we have to enable those nation-states to function properly and those armies to function properly, because the solution of this, which essentially is a fallout of the post-Ottoman settlement, will only be found within the region, but we have a responsibility within that region, and whether we like it or not, we are no longer the great power that can actually underwrite any of their settlements or actually bring about those changes. We have to do it with others. And whilst we were debating today, I just saw on the news that Denmark is now supporting sending in 7 F-16s. So the coalition of support is widening in order to enable. And that also takes me then to that question the member for Wolverhampton South East raised, where he said, why are we not talking about Syria? Well, the reason why I think this debate is so narrow a frame comes from the lessons I hope we've learned from last year, where if you come to this House and you can't explain yourself in a way which takes the House with it, you have to be by far more cautious in future steps. We will return to this subject. This is not a given, but at this stage, I think we can bring the parties together, we can be part of the international coalition. And can I also just say to the House, it is incredibly foolish to think that just because we are not going into Syria, there isn't something's going to happen in Syria. That we are the only actor that will bring about the change. But the fundamental lesson of today for this House has to be, it is the functioning nation states in that region which will be enabled to deal with the terrorism, will have to deal with the terrorists. And we have to aid and assist and take the lead from them. And this then, of course, does also require that you Saudi Arabias, that you Qatars, you Bahrain, and Iran have to take on responsible positions. And I really hope that in the wind-up, we hear just a little bit more about Turkey and the effect in Kurdistan. Certainly.
Well, to my honourable friend on this, there is a real problem, and that is who is going to have the strength and the determination tomorrow, next year, the year after that, to be on the ground, whose boots will be on the ground in Iraq. Because so far nobody has said who. Nobody has said who will do it today, tomorrow, or the year after.
In fairness to the Prime Minister and to the Leader of the Opposition, I think they did say that that would have to be within the establishing of a functioning Iraqi army. And we know that airstrikes on their own aren't sufficient. We've learned that in Libya. You know, just going in and getting rid of the head of state is not the answer. That is simply the beginning of an answer. I think there's a clear strategy, and this is why it's important for this House not to lose the determination and the will to pursue and enable. And as I was saying about Turkey, I hope the front bench will come back, say a bit more about Turkey, say a bit more about what it means to arm the Kurds and what effect that may have on the Turkish government. And also, finally, what thoughts there are in terms of a UN resolution. Those who say, because it's unlikely to get another UN resolution, should be reminded that you should nevertheless try your damnedest to get one, because it's only after that that you have a moral authority to consider different options.
Sir Alan Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, I support the Prime Minister and this motion today and welcome the support of the official opposition. As someone who's focused on the Middle East for over 30 years, I was intending today to come and urge the House to be particularly cautious and sober in approaching this decision today, but I think it's quite clear that that is exactly the mood of the House and this debate. And it needs to be, because we're about to embark on something unlike anything we have ever seen before. And in my mind, it shows every sign of being neither easy nor conclusive. When the Falklands were invaded, force was obviously justified. When Kuwait was invaded, we were right to work with others to repel the aggressor, and in each case we knew instinctively what the objective was, and we absolutely knew when we had attained it. But this is different. Now, I think we're justified in deploying our armed forces, both to fight vicious extremists and to support Iraq's request for help. But the clear strategic objective in doing so and the manner in which we will use our weapons are much more difficult to shape than in the past. In a moment. Yes, why not get that? Thank you.
I was going to take up his exact point. Doesn't the lack of strategic objective manifest itself in one particular way? We've heard that this could go on for some time, and we haven't heard a criterion for stopping, let alone a criterion for what we're going to achieve.
My whole point, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to live with that uncertainty because we are living in an age that lacks the clarity of the past. But that does not mean that we do nothing. Because we'll be acting in a region whose turmoil and disruption is more difficult to comprehend than anything we've ever seen. And that means, and this is exactly my answer to my right honourable friend, that the path ahead is far from obvious. Now, personally, I've only been in favour of the UK taking action if it's part of a coordinated international effort. Well, we've now got that. And it's reassuring to be alongside Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and of course the United States and France. But again, I say, none of this is going to be straightforward. Wisdom is not weakness, particularly in the Middle East. And in the complicated melee of today's Middle East, we would be wise to appreciate that we're confronting a new threat in a new way, and therefore we should calibrate our expectations accordingly. And I have to say in passing that I'm a little uncomfortable with the language of some people, essentially outside this House mainly, who seem to see this decision as a test of the United Kingdom's virility. That's no way to look at this issue. And it harks back to an age and a mentality which simply does not suit the world of today. Now, the country needs to know why we are doing this, and I think the justification for our involvement is best expressed in terms of what it will do to improve Iraq, its people, and the region itself, and less by saying that it is mainly because terrorists directly threaten us here in the UK. That threat exists anyway, and it will not be eliminated even if Isil is forced into submission. Now, as my right honourable friend for Mid-Sussex referred to, we also have to be realistic about how little we really know. The rise of Isil has taken us all by surprise, and knowing in detail and with confidence who they are and what exactly is happening on the ground is not going to be easy. Our sort of well of understanding about the region has run rather dry. And if I might say so, I will. This House would do better not to be so quick to mock the honourable member for Bradford West.
Gentleman, he's making a very good speech, and could I ask him, is he uneasy about the way the gates are opening on this motion? The motion that's in front of us today could, as has been mentioned earlier, open up bombing in Iraq by the UK for up to the next 10 years, at least, because it's open-ended.
Let me answer the honourable gentleman, if I may, this way, because it's really my main point. It's this. We're not looking at one country invading another. We're not looking at a national army marching across a border. What we are looking at is a conflict without borders and the advance of non-state actors who have no national identity, no seat in the UN, and no coherent political structure. The threat is not from a rogue state or a vicious dictator. It's from a poisonous, viral movement which is cutting a swathe of grisly barbarity across the region from Syria to Iraq. And that enemy can morph into Al-Qaeda one day, it can disappear into the crowd and come back again the next. So we can resolve to beat them, but it's not the same as fighting a country. Now, as my right honourable friend, the member for Sutton Coldfield, I think sensibly mentioned, what can we target? What can we hit? What can we be sure we are bombing in the right way? Can we perhaps disable infrastructure rather than destroy it? And how will we continue to be effective from the air should ISIL forces move into a dense urban setting? Mr. Speaker, for all these reasons, we must expect to give our Prime Minister flexibility and discretion without us descending into political recrimination. He must be allowed to adapt and amend our actions to suit the unfolding acts on the ground, and in my opinion, a view which has been expressed by my right honourable friends for Croydon South, Rushcliffe and North Somerset, that should not exclude spreading air attacks into the deserts, of Syria. And may I conclude by saying this? Taking on ISIL is not just about bombs. It requires comprehensive confrontation. Diplomatic, social, religious, cultural, educational, financial, and through the media and the use of intelligence. They must be beaten on all fronts. Mr. Speaker, this may go on for years. It might not. But we should today be prepared to start our action. But equally, should it ever become too impractical or inappropriate to fight from the air, then we should also, without shame, stain or blame, also be prepared to stop it.
Mr. Frank Dobson.
Mr. Speaker, one thing is certain, and that is that no one in this House or anywhere else can be certain that the policies we're being asked to endorse will succeed. And if we look at the track record of the interventions of the French, the British and the Americans in the Middle East since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, then the odds look as though we won't succeed because everything else has gone wrong. And yet, I find myself probably going to vote for the motion tonight. And the argument that I would put is this, that the situation we face is different from previous ones. Clearly, what has happened is a threat to international peace and security, and therefore entitles the world powers and the government of Iraq to invite support to try to protect them against their invaders. It may not be an invading army, but it's certainly an invasion that Iraq has suffered, and Iraq are entitled to call upon the rest of us. And they are faced with a genocidal outfit. Genocide consists of killing people because of who they are, and that is exactly what ISIS is doing. In any war, some prisoners will be murdered. In many wars, some women will be raped. It's usually the product of indiscipline. In this case, with ISIS, this is part of their military strategy to terrorize people. And it is organised murder and organised abduction of women and organised rape of Muslim women. And that's not Western propaganda, which is their usual excuse. They are parading proudly what they're doing. They are showing on social media the murder of prisoners, the carting off and abduction of women.
My right honourable friend, well, just on that very briefly. Would he agree? Would he agree? I agree with everything he's said, but would he agree that when we use drone missiles and we attack from the air, that isn't precision? It can't be precision. And when we get into this, if we start killing children and doing schools and hospitals, public support for this will go away very quickly.
Well, that may be true, but it has to be said that without the American intervention from the air, the chances are that ISIS would now be in control of Baghdad. they had to be stopped militarily, and one of the functions of the air attacks is to take away their use of heavy weaponry to try to give those who are opposed to them a better chance of defeating them. And it is necessary, therefore, it seems to me, to provide an opportunity for the ground forces to get their act together and take them on. And if what we are doing can weaken their opponents during that time, that's all the better. And it can only be the effort that everyone agrees, which is for political activity, for political reconciliation, for bringing people together, for trying to unite the people of Iraq against their common enemy. That can only be done if we are helping them keep the common enemy at bay until they've got themselves sorted out. And so that's why, on balance, I will be supporting this motion. I certainly give way.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. The points that he was quite rightly making about the brutality of ISIS, particularly towards women, could apply equally to other organisations such as Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. And doesn't he agree that that determination to support the moderates against the extremists and to use all our soft power needs to be looked at far more widely than just the Middle East?
It's certainly true that as part of our tradition, which we sometimes fall short of and have done in the past, but part of our tradition is to try to promote decency and democracy worldwide. And we have an obligation to all those countries who are trying to either maintain their democracy or to establish democracy in the face of extremism, to try to give them help. But in this case, there was not just the possibility, but the likelihood that Iraq as a sovereign state was going to disappear. And unless we keep up the pressure, there would still be a possibility of it disappearing. When people talk, though, I do get concerned about the ease with which some people seem to slip from Iraq to Syria. In Iraq, it's clear there are two existing groups on the same side against ISIS. Yeah. They hope to get further military support on the ground to help them. That's fairly straightforward. But when people talk about getting involved in Syria, are they talking about sending young people from our country to a place where they won't have the faintest idea who they're supposed to be fighting, and people who they might have been allied with this week becoming enemies the next week, or enemies this week becoming allies the next week? We owe it to our people, if we're going to send them abroad on our behalf and risk their lives, that we try to make sure that they are faced with a fairly straightforward function in war. War's nasty and complex enough as it is without pushing them into somewhere like Syria. And I would just say, Mr. Speaker, when I first entered this House, they used to talk about senior figures, and people talk about senior figures now. Well, when I first entered this House, senior figures included Dennis Healey and one or two other people like that. And they had a bit of a down on sending young people to war. And the reason they had a bit of a down on it was they'd been sent. And we should always remember to be very, very careful about sending anybody else's children to fight for us, particularly if we try to send them in a cause that isn't clear and against an enemy that can be easily identified.
Sir Nick Harvey.
Mr. Speaker, having opposed in 2003, along with my party colleagues, the invasion of Iraq, I have deliberated uncomfortably and cautiously for the last few weeks with the issues upon which we must decide today. But I have been persuaded of both the justification and the need for action of the sort that we are being asked to approve today. Many people in the chamber have already spoken today about the humanitarian atrocities which are being perpetrated by ISIS Surely to goodness we must learn from the mistakes of Srebrenica and Rwanda and not make the mistake of simply allowing it to happen. But beyond that, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank my right honourable friend for giving way. My right honourable friend talks about the atrocities going on. I have a gentleman living in my constituency who's part of the Yazidi group, and the paperwork and the photographs that he showed me of the atrocities going on, this is absolutely a just motion today and something we must all support.
Well, I very much hope that that's something that everybody across the House would agree, whatever their particular take on the military issues to be discussed. But beyond the humanitarian catastrophe, there is the strategic threat, which will grow over time, with ISIS already, as we have heard, controlling an area bigger than Britain, and with the stated objective and ambition to go further and to make that bigger and bigger. And we have seen in the past from Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan what will happen if terrorist organisations with international ambitions are allowed the freedom of manoeuvre that would give them. ISIS have manpower, they have got hold of very sophisticated equipment, they have got a flow of money. They are quite a formidable enemy for the Iraqi army and the Kurdish forces, and that is why they are looking outside their borders for external help. Yes, it would be better, as the honourable gentleman from Bradford West said, if the clear lead was being given by some of the regional neighbours and by Muslim states. And we are very grateful, I hope, for the efforts that are being made by some of the neighbours. But the moral responsibility does fall on countries like the United Kingdom, because we are one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and because, having a substantial Muslim population ourselves, we have more than most to fear from the growth of ISIS if it was allowed to go unchecked. So there is, in my view, a just cause, there is a clear legal case, there is a plausible objective to degrade ISIS and enable the Iraqi and Kurdish fighters to recover the terrain that they have lost, and there's a strategy that we will use our air power to soften up the enemy and allow the ground forces to recover that ground. We're not going to deploy our own, but we'll help them to do it. Can it work? Members are asking. Well, there are no guarantees, but it could. If there is a detailed plan, bluntly, I don't know what it is, but on the need-to-know basis, I don't need to know. We don't know how long it's going to take, what it's going to cost, what, short of outright triumph, is actually our exit strategy. But I was impressed by the fact that the Prime Minister was very realistic about the limitations of what air power can do. He was also very realistic, I thought, about the limitations of what military power can do, because the military effort has to be accompanied by a humanitarian aid effort, by diplomatic efforts, by efforts to find a political solution, because it's absolutely right, as so many have said today, you do not find a political solution to a complex situation on the ground from 20,000 feet. I also welcome the fact that the Prime Minister was, I thought, appropriately modest about the contribution that the UK is proposing to make. Of course, we will be supplying forces who are highly skilled and very courageous and will go with the goodwill of all of us, and they will be using very sophisticated equipment. But there is absolutely no place for hubris on the part of the United Kingdom about the scale of the overall effort that we are going to make. I give way to my honourable friend.
Right, honourable friend. But is it not the case that the United Kingdom is already making a very substantial military contribution in the form of our intelligence gathering assets, as well, both the rivet joint and the tornado with its lightning?
My honourable friend makes a very important point, and I think that, in truth, the value that we can add to the international effort in terms of our aerial reconnaissance and our intelligence gathering is probably of more significance than what we are going to contribute in terms of outright firepower. And another point that the honourable gentleman from Bradford West made, which I think is worth reflecting upon, is that although ISIS are controlling an area as large as Britain, they will not marshal themselves neatly into conventional military bases which render themselves as obvious targets, and therefore the quality of the intelligence and the surveillance is going to be absolutely critical to the outcome of this effort. So, broadly speaking, there is a just cause, there is a plausible strategy, and there is a need for us to contribute to it. My greatest misgiving in listening to the way the debate has unfolded today would relate to Syria. Many members have made the point that harrying and hassling ISIS in Iraq is pointless if they can simply flee over the border into Syria. And in purely military terms, I certainly see what they mean. But the fact of the matter is that the strategy that has been laid out before us of our air support working in tandem with a credible, organised ground force simply would not apply in Syria. Bluntly, the situation on the ground in Syria is chaos and carnage. There is no credible ground force at this stage with whom we can ally. And although we may have common cause to some extent with Russia, with Assad and with Iran over the desirability of degrading ISIS, they have got very different views from us as to what they would want to see emerge on the ground as the lasting solution in Syria, and we need to be aware of the dangers that that would pose. Apart from anything else, I don't think there is any appetite in the United Kingdom for us getting involved in an ongoing operation lasting many, many years on the ground, trying to instill a new order which, if we get involved in Syria, is the likely outcome. It was General Danat who said, if you go around kicking down the door, you create a moral imperative to stay around and help clear up afterwards. I think we're rightly fed up with the amount of work we've had to do on that in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think Syria is a very different issue from Iraq, and we would end up doing the same there if we didn't watch it.
Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras is completely right to warn us about the gravity of this decision. I think sending British troops to take military action is the most serious question we're ever going to be asked to answer. But faced with a brutal and murderous organisation that has kidnapped and beheaded victims, including a British aid worker, which has carried out genocide, enslaved women, buried others alive, crucified, executed, and literally butchered Christians, Yazidis and Muslims too. In fact, anybody who doesn't share their warped and perverted view of Islam, which presents a huge threat to the rest of the region. And with an international coalition having been built in the region, then I think it is right to confront ISIL. But I would like to ask, as my right honourable friend, the member for Wolverhampton South East did earlier, why we're being asked to approve airstrikes in Iraq, but not in Syria. I'd like to ask why we welcomed and supported the American bombardment of ISIL targets in Syria this week, but said that British action should be limited to Iraq. Why, if we think the American action was legal, why action by Britain would not be. I'd like to ask what the difference is between taking action against ISIL on one side of the border is from taking it on the other. As we've heard, even though the border doesn't actually exist. Are we saying that we would take action against terrorists responsible for beheading a British citizen on one side of the border, but we would not target them if they scuttled a few yards across into Syria? As I understand it, we're prepared to take action in Iraq because the government there asked us to. And so I'd like to ask if this means that we would be prepared to take action against ISIL terrorists in Syria if the murderous dictator Assad asked us to do it there, because we must really avoid giving anybody the impression that he's got a veto over any action that we might take. And it's really important too that we avoid giving any impression that Putin, who's annexed Crimea, invaded Ukraine, who incarcerates his critics at home and murders them abroad, that he's got a veto over any sort of Western action too. I think we should have, the truth is, I think we should have acted sooner to support those amongst the rebels who want democracy and human rights when the revolution against Assad started. The tragedy is that the Democrats who looked to us for support have been slaughtered. They were starved of the resources, the weapons and support they needed. They were killed on one side by Assad, supported by Russia, Iran and Hezbollah, and by extremists on the other, supported by Qatar and Saudi Arabia. The result has been that the only people not involved in Syria have been the Western democracies. And as it's been said earlier, there's a consequence. There are consequences, of course, to taking action, but there are grave consequences to not taking action as well. And in Syria, I think the West's failure has created a vacuum in which the Isil terrorists have allowed to become so strong. The truth now is that both Assad and ISIS are stronger now than they were a year ago. And I think we should not just be supporting and arming the Iraqi army and the Kurdish forces. I think the West should be doing much, much more to help the pro-Western, the pluralist Democrats amongst the Syrian opposition and supporting them in their efforts as well.
Sir Gerald Howarth.
Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to take part in this debate, and as my right honourable friend for Rutland said, there are no simple solutions to this complex issue, and I think the debate we've heard today illustrates the complexity that we as legislators, having to take decisions on behalf of the British people, face. But I do think my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, made a very compelling case. I thought it was absolutely excellent speech. I agree with every word of it. I'm in fact trying to press upon him that we should be taking this action sooner, but I understand why he couldn't, because he was not prepared to bring a motion before the House, and he was not certain of securing the result, and I don't blame him for that caution. But he posed the question, and where is the British national interest? And we need to be satisfied that the British national interest is met by the strategy that he has set out today. And I believe the answer is crystal clear, that it is in the British national interest that we should support this motion today. All the leaders around the world have declared that these ISIS people are beyond the pale, that they are a major threat, not just to the Middle East, but also to us here at home. And as my honourable friend said a moment ago, my right honourable friend, they have overrun a large part of Iraq already, and they have threatened to overrun the whole of that country with their resorting to their barbaric methods of so doing, methods which we had ruled out and most countries had abandoned centuries ago. We've seen, and our constituents have seen, the slaughter of innocent people. They have seen the way in which these barbaric people have been behaving, and they have seen our own nationals and US nationals murdered as well. Now, it seems to me, therefore, that if this threat is so great, we have to address it. And I think there are two clear issues. There is a blurred line between them, it is true. But the imperative today is that we should prevent IS from overrunning the whole of Iraq. Indeed, the objective must be to drive them out of Iraq as far as we possibly can. And as the right honourable member for Holborn and St Pancras so eloquently said, it is not a question of making an act of faith here. We have seen it work, and the people on the ground, the troops that are on the ground, have said that without the intervention of the United States airstrikes, they would not have been able to blunt the attack of IS in northern Iraq. So we know it works. It is not as though we are trying to suggest something for which we have no intimation what might happen. Yes.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's absolutely right. This motion is squarely within the national interest. He talks about being honest with the British people, and we must do that, of course, and I support this action. But would he agree with me that the truth is we don't know how long we're going to be involved for here, we don't know how long this is going to take, we do not know in any finite terms where this will end, and we want to be honest with the British people about that.
The honourable gentleman makes an entirely fair point, but I'm afraid to say that is the case with all military action. You cannot start any military operation, say at the outset, this is going to take 6 months. I think at the outbreak of the First World War, which we've been commemorating this year, the expectation was that everybody would be home by Christmas. Turned out to be rather a false hope, a tragically false hope. So I'm afraid it goes with the territory of military operations. Yes.
It's been said throughout the debate how important it is that we have the coalition of Arab states that we are supporting. What I'm less clear about is Who will be directing operations? I wonder if he can share some light on that.
The Honourable Lady makes a very good point. If she could be patient, I do intend to come on to that, because I think that's the involvement of the Arab states is, I think, one of the most significant points about this whole business. But the key to the imperative of ridding Iraq of IS leads to the possibility of dealing with the problem at the political level. It is imperative that we provide Haider al-Abadi, the new Prime Minister of Iraq, with the space in which to deliver the resolution of the differences between the competing communities in Iraq. He cannot do that if his whole country is threatened by these barbarous people intent upon overrunning it. But the onus is upon him to deliver that political settlement. Now, the Honourable Lady has rightly mentioned the involvement of other countries, and I think it's very important that we should not only be standing alongside our friends in the United States, and that is important. They are our closest ally. We do have the same concept of freedom between the United States and ourselves. I think it is important to do that, but it's also important to be seen to be standing alongside our allies in the Arab world. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a close ally. I was reminded by Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE that we had no excuse for not understanding the region. We'd been there for 200 years. It is a fact that we have experience which other countries do not have of the region, and they do look to us for support. And the fact that KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, is there, the UAE are there, Qatar and Jordan, I think is the most significant development in this whole business. And I think that, as my honourable friend for the North East Bedfordshire said, that we should not underestimate the importance of that. And to a certain extent, our credibility is at stake. Now, the leader of the opposition said we need to define what our role in the world is. He's absolutely right. And my right honourable friend, the former Foreign Secretary, now leader of the House, said in opposition in 2009 that the United Kingdom should help to shape the world in which we find ourselves, not simply be shaped by it. And I think this is a moment where we should assist in that process. And in assisting our friends in the Arab world, we should also be encouraging them to take responsibility for what is essentially a regional problem of theirs. And I think one of the exciting things has been to see a UAE female pilot involved in this. I mean, that is the ultimate insult to the IS people, I'm sure. But let us salute her and her role in this. And my honourable friend from New Forest East made the point that perhaps the Arabs should help by putting more boots on the ground as well, and I think that's true. In my final 45 seconds, Mr. Speaker, may I say, my final point is this, that we will not resolve the IS problem simply by military means. As the honourable member, right honourable member from the East said, and I agree with everything he said, you'll be horrified by that, but there we go. The case for striking in Syria is quite strong. But we cannot defeat an ideology by military means alone, let alone by airstrikes. That is a challenge for the Muslim world more generally. But I hope that all this exercise will feed into our strategic defence review, which is coming up. We need a proper strategy, and we need to feed in the experience of this recent political development into that strategy.
Yeah. We're here again to discuss the issue of stability and conflict in the Middle East. It appears that we haven't learnt the lessons of a decade ago. I made one of my first speeches soon after my maiden speech in this House after 9/11 on what had gone on. And it's clear that we haven't taken those lessons forward in order to move forward to provide stability for that region. Over the last 14 years or so, we haven't done significant to be able to understand and look at those issues. Instead of that, what we've done, and the US, using its influence in the Gulf countries to start to pump more money and to pump more weapons into Syria to further destabilize that region, to put money into people that we may think would be our supporters, to put money into those people that we thought were on our side and were perhaps moderate, as we've been told. When we look at the moderate Syrian people, we talk about the freedom fighters that we speak about, and vast majority of them, Mr. Speaker, are affiliated to the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that we have banned and the Prime Minister has banned in this country, yet we think they are going to be our resolve in resolving the issue in Syria. A number of members today have got up and said that the issue can only be resolved if we put more money and resources into the freedom fighters. Well, which part of those freedom fighters are we going to support? Are we going to support the Muslim Brotherhood? Are we going to support Al-Nusra? Are we going to support other extremist organizations that already exist? Are we going to support the un-Islamic State in both the regions? And I call this deliberately not ISIL, not ISIS, ISIS, not IS. I call it, and Burmese predominantly tend to call it, the un-Islamic State. That's what it is. It has no place in the religion of Islam that I am part of. It has no place in any teachings of Islam. It has no place when these people go out and they rape, they murder, they torture, they carry out all of those things that are banned in Islam. They kill people because they might be Sunni. They kill people that they are Shias, that they are Christians, that they are Yazidis, that they are Kurds, and they kill anybody who doesn't submit to their warped ideology. And we have to be aware of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to address. We've had too many people, like our own the former Foreign Secretary, who was prepared to go across to Europe and to say that we need to lift the arms embargo against the Assad government, and so we can supply those so-called moderate fighters that he proclaimed. And once he'd come back with that great accolade of achieving the lifting of the arms embargo, and he sat down with the security people, and they said to him, Secretary of State, who are you going to supply these weapons to? And very soon he decided that there was no option of supplying those weapons, and decided that we were going to provide communication aid to those people that are there. So once we create these types of vacuums, and Senator McCain, who has been an advocate of a neocon policy in Syria, of making sure that we put as much money and as much of the arms that we possibly can to do this. What we've not realized is that what we've done as part of that effort over the last 3 years or so is that we've created that vacuum to allow the un-Islamic State to be formed in those regions, taking people from all different extremists that were there to be further extreme than the last people that are there, to be more grotesque than any other organization, to be more violent than to the Honourable Member.
I'm very anxious to give the Honourable Member an extra minute, because I want to hear from him what is he saying we should and should not do in the case of that faces us today, and he's in danger of getting to the end of his speech without telling us.
I thank the Honourable Member for doing that, and I'm very keen to get on to today. I will be supporting in the vote later on today on the support that we'll provide to the Iraqi government, because they quite rightly asked us to do that. I will go further than that. I will also say that there will be a need for us to get in and support on the ground some of the people that in order to finish this job off. This job needs to be finished off properly, because if it isn't, if you allow significant groupings to remain in the areas that are there in Iraq, then we'll have greater problems for us to go back and try and resolve. So in order for us to do that, we not only need the airstrikes, we will need the Arab countries that are surrounding us to put their money where their mouth is, by and large, to actually get people on the ground to deal with this. They will need the support of our people to do that. So I think it's very important that we do that. It's important that we get this this issue sorted out to deal with it, but we need to move on to do that. And I say again, a huge number of Muslim academics and scholars have condemned that, and also people like Inspire, an organisation led by Sarah Khan, an organisation that works for women, to do that. Thank you. Very quickly.
I just want to ask my honourable friend, will it be possible to defeat these terrorists, these evil people, while simultaneously turning a blind eye to the evils that exist in some of our allies. Surely Iran and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and some of our other allies have got to get their acts sorted out as well.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that. I do believe he's right in saying what he said. Unless we play with a straight bat across the piece and condemn those actions that are not viable, then we won't be able to do so. I think it's very important that we do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my intention, when the House divides, if it does divide this afternoon, to support the government's motion. But in doing that, I'm very mindful, having listened to the honourable member for Perry-Barr, my honourable friend, the member for Gravesham, indeed even the honourable member for Bradford West, if he hadn't perhaps treated the House as a sort of recipient of a human foghorn, that they had some important points to make, and a note of caution needs to be sounded about what we are trying to do. The Prime Minister made a powerful case. He said, firstly, that Isil was a threat to this country directly. I have no doubt at all that he's right about that, having spent certainly the first 6 months of this year signing off consents for the prosecution of young people returning from Syria, where they had served and trained with Isil, in some circumstances with rather clear evidence, it seemed to me, that they had participated in atrocities. I'm perfectly alive to the fact that that threat is a real one. But I would simply sound this note of caution, that it seems to me that simply bombing Isil, whether it's in Syria or Iraq, as we're planning to do, is not going to make that threat go away. Even if we ultimately get rid of the ungoverned space, the threat will remain unless or until civil society exists within the Muslim world of a kind that provides a model of how people can coexist peacefully. And we face a challenge domestically which we mustn't shirk, in terms of persuading people that that peaceful coexistence exists here and that they shouldn't be inclined to emulate what they see in the Middle East. The second one, and for me I have to say the most persuasive, is the genocide that is being perpetrated in northern Iraq and Syria. This country has a long history of international involvement, and whilst we may only be able to make a small contribution, I do find it difficult to see how we should sit on our hands when a barbarous group of individuals perpetrate the kinds of crimes that we are seeing daily on our screens.
Absolutely right.
If we can make a contribution to dealing with that, then it seems to me that the justification for military intervention is there.
Am I welcome to give way? Wait for my friend who makes a very compelling case, based also on the issue of genocide. And so would he then himself advise the House that in relation to the legal principle of the responsibility to protect, in relation to genocide, that has a wide application that goes beyond the Iraqi borders into Syria?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. It's precisely the next point to which I was about to come. So far as the legal framework is concerned, I have not the slightest doubt that the legal framework exists to take action in support of the Iraqi government at its request to deal with Isil. I'm quite clear that the legal base is present for that, and the House should not be concerned on that issue. Equally, I would add that so far as action in Syria is concerned, should the House ever be minded to pursue that option, or the government wish to pursue it and the House to debate it, then it does seem to me that in fact the preconditions for action in Syria are also present. Firstly, because of the right to self-defence of the Iraqi government when some of the attacks are clearly coming across the Syrian border, and secondly, because of the doctrine of humanitarian necessity in terms of intervention to protect the population in northern Syria from the attacks of Isil, something which we've seen in recent days with Kurdish villages up by the Turkish border. The leader of the opposition, in his speech, rightly said and raised the issue as to whether on that latter point there shouldn't be a resolution of the United Nations Security Council. There's no doubt that the United Nations Security Council in issues concerning humanitarian necessity has an important role to play. But of course the government is going to at least have to consider whether any application, if it were to come to the United Nations for a Security Council resolution, stands any prospect of success. The ability to intervene, I have no doubt, exists even if no such resolution is present. But the Leader of the Opposition's comments and those of honourable members do highlight one of the really important challenges we face. just because the framework for legal intervention is present, will not necessarily mean that the intervention which subsequently takes place meets the criteria of lawfulness. It has to be reasonable, necessary and proportionate for the aim that has to be achieved. And in that I can well understand the government making a distinction between the situation in Syria and the situation in Iraq. I have to say that even in the context of Iraq, there seem to me to be some pretty serious challenges. Some of our partners, including particularly the Iraqi government, have a rather checkered record when it comes to human rights. We must avoid being party to the ill treatment of prisoners, to the massacre of prisoners, or indeed to any action on the battlefield which we might facilitate by our aerial intervention, which could take place. And I trust that the government will have been looking carefully at that in finding ways of cooperating. But the moment one, I won't give way, I must finish. But the moment one looks at that, it becomes immediately apparent why the situation in Syria is likely to be so much more challenging. But having made those comments, I'd like to emphasise that the fact that there are challenges, whether they be legal or ethical, is not a reason for doing nothing. And it seems to me that precisely because we have a tradition in this country of observing the rule of law, of maintaining human rights even in the battlefield context, and that we have an interest in ensuring that civil society is facilitated in an area where has been so singularly deprived of it, that we actually have a duty to take action. And what this motion enables us to do is to give the government the framework in which that can occur.
Order. The Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Oldham West and Royton will be the last honourable member to be subject to the 5-minute limit. Thereafter, in a bid to maximise the number of honourable and right honourable members who can contribute, I shall have to reduce the limit to 4 minutes for backbench speeches. The first right honourable gentleman to be impacted upon by that new limit, I give him notice, will be the right honourable member for Gainsborough, Mr Michael Meacher.
I think it cannot be emphasised too strongly that this is not another invasion of Iraq. It is a response to a desperate plea by the new Iraqi government for outside help to combat what is seen as an existential threat to the Iraqi state. Nor is